Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed about happiness was wrong. That's exactly what happened to me 5 years ago, standing in the middle of a crowded party, surrounded by friends, family, and colleagues who adored me. I had the perfect social life, the kind people dream about. My phone buzzed constantly with invitations. My weekends were packed with brunches, dinners, and events. My social media feeds were enviable showcases of connection and togetherness. By all outward appearances, I was living the ideal life. Yet in that moment, champagne glass in hand, smile plastered on my face, I felt a hollowness so profound, it nearly brought me to my knees. Have you ever felt completely alone in a room full of people who love you? Have you ever maintained animated conversations while an inner voice screams that something fundamental is missing? The truth hit me with startling clarity. I had built my entire concept of happiness around other people. I had crafted my identity as someone who was never alone, never without company, never facing the silence of my own thoughts. And in doing so, I had created the perfect disguise for my profound unhappiness. This is not the story you expect to hear. We're conditioned to believe that happiness comes from connection, from relationships, from avoiding solitude at all costs. Loneliness is portrayed as the enemy, something to be feared and evaded through constant companionship. The conventional wisdom tells us that humans are social creatures who wither in isolation. But what if that's not the complete truth? What if the path to genuine happiness doesn't always lead through constant companionship, but sometimes directly through the heart of solitude? My journey began with that uncomfortable revelation at the party. I excused myself, drove home, and for the first time in years I sat in perfect silence and asked myself a question that would change everything. Who am I when no one is watching? I didn't know the answer. After decades of defining myself through others' eyes, I had no idea who I was in solitude. That terrified me, and it should have. I had built my life on a foundation that required constant external validation and presence. Recent research from the University of Virginia found something remarkable. People would rather administer mild electric shocks to themselves than sit alone with their thoughts for just 15 minutes. Think about that. Physical pain was preferable to solitude for many participants. We've become that uncomfortable with our own company. But here's the surprising twist. Those who learn to be comfortable in solitude report higher levels of life satisfaction, more authentic relationships, and greater emotional resilience than those who depend on constant companionship. Eleanor Rigby, a leading psychologist specializing in solitude studies, discovered that people who develop a positive relationship with solitude score significantly higher on measures of psychological well-being than those who avoid being alone. Her groundbreaking research showed that the capacity to be happily alone is actually a stronger predictor of life satisfaction than the quantity or even quality of social connections. This isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting human connection. Rather, it's about discovering that true happiness begins within, not as a cliché, but as a neurological and psychological reality. When you learn to generate joy, peace, and fulfillment from within, your external relationships transform from desperate necessities into beautiful choices. Think of it like learning to prepare your own nourishing meals versus always needing to eat at restaurants. Both can be wonderful experiences, but only one gives you true independence and sustainability. I realize this might sound counterintuitive, perhaps even threatening to everything you've been taught about happiness. That's precisely why it's so powerful. Consider the paradox that exists in our hyper-connected world. Rates of loneliness have doubled since the 1980s, despite our unprecedented ability to connect. Nearly 61% of Americans report feeling lonely regularly, a figure that increased dramatically even before pandemic isolation. We're more connected yet more alone than ever. Why? Because we've confused connection with presence. We've mistaken social activity for meaningful engagement. We've outsourced our happiness to others instead of cultivating it within ourselves. My own journey from social butterfly to someone who finds profound joy in solitude didn't happen overnight. It began with small, uncomfortable steps. I cancelled plans one weekend. I turned off my phone. I sat with the discomfort of having nothing but my own thoughts for company. Those first hours were excruciating. My mind raced with anxieties. What was I missing? Who was talking about me? What opportunities were passing me by? I felt the physical symptoms of withdrawal, restlessness, anxiety, even panic. But then something unexpected happened. As the hours passed, the noise in my mind began to quiet. I noticed the subtle play of sunlight through my window. I heard birds I'd never paid attention to before. I felt the rhythm of my own breathing. And slowly, tentatively, I began to feel a different kind of connection, not to others but to myself. This transformation wasn't easy or immediate. There were moments of crushing loneliness, nights when I questioned everything, but gradually I discovered something revolutionary. Being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. In fact, they were entirely different experiences. Loneliness is a painful feeling of disconnection, a sense of being cut off from others when you desire connection. Solitude, by contrast, is a state of being alone without feeling lonely, a peaceful, even joyful experience of keeping yourself company. The distinction is crucial. One brings suffering, the other can bring profound peace and self-discovery. Ancient wisdom traditions have long recognized what modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Solitude is not just beneficial, but essential for deep happiness. From Buddhist monks to Christian mystics to secular philosophers, those who have pursued the deepest understanding of human happiness have invariably spent significant time in solitude. The Dalai Lama spends hours alone in meditation daily. Henry David Thoreau's 2 years at Walden Pond produced insights about joy and meaning that still resonate centuries later. Even in the corporate world, leaders like Bill Gates take regular think weeks in isolation to reconnect with their creativity and purpose. What do these diverse practices share? The recognition that something valuable emerges in solitude that cannot be accessed in constant company. My personal epiphany came about 6 months into my solitude practice. I had taken myself to dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try. Previously, I would never have considered dining alone. The very thought would have filled me with anxiety. What would people think? Wouldn't I look pathetic, abandoned, unwanted? But that evening, something shifted. Sitting at my table, savoring each bite with complete attention, I realized I was having more pleasure in this meal than I'd experienced in countless dinners with companions. There was no need to maintain conversation, no splitting my attention, no performing enjoyment for someone else's benefit. It was just me, the food, and the moment, and it was glorious. A middle-aged woman stopped by my table as she was leaving. "I just wanted to tell you," she said, "that you look so peaceful and content. I've never had the courage to dine alone like that." Her comment startled me. I had been so concerned about appearing lonely or unwanted that I hadn't considered I might be projecting something entirely different, something that others might even envy. This brings us to a critical understanding. Our fear of solitude is largely learned, not innate. Children naturally move between social engagement and solitary exploration without attaching shame to either state. It's only as we absorb cultural messages through movies portraying solo diners as objects of pity, through the concerned questions when we're not dating, through the suspicion directed at those who prefer their own company, that we learn to equate being alone with failure. The good news: learned attitudes can be unlearned, conditioned responses can be reconditioned. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When we consistently practice solitude with a positive mindset, we actually create new neural pathways. The brain's default response to being alone shifts from triggering stress hormones to releasing calming neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA. What once felt threatening becomes nurturing. Dr. Robert Koplan's research at Carleton University found that embracing positive solitude activates the default mode network in the brain, the same network associated with creativity, self-awareness, and psychological well-being. In other words, choosing solitude isn't just a philosophical stance, it literally rewires your brain for greater happiness. This neuroplasticity explains why the initial discomfort of solitude gradually transforms into pleasure with practice. Your brain is physically adapting to recognize alone time as rewarding rather than threatening. My own brain was certainly rewiring itself. Activities I once couldn't imagine enjoying alone, movies, concerts, traveling, became adventures in presence and self-discovery. I found myself noticing details I'd missed when distracted by companionship. I began to trust my own reactions instead of looking to others for cues about how to feel. This isn't to say that the journey was linear. There were setbacks, holidays when familial pressure made me question my new path, moments of doubt when old friends moved forward with traditional milestones like marriages and children, while my life took a different shape. One particularly difficult evening, I called my sister in tears. "What if I'm just rationalizing?" I asked her. "What if I'm calling loneliness independence because I can't admit I've failed at relationships?" Her response was gentle but transformative. "The fact that you can ask that question shows you're not rationalizing. Those who truly lie to themselves don't question their narratives. Besides, I've never seen you more at peace than you've been this past year." She was right. Despite occasional doubts, I was experiencing a depth of contentment previously unknown to me. I slept better. I made decisions with greater clarity. My creativity flourished. And most surprisingly, my relationships, fewer but deeper, improved dramatically. When I no longer needed others to fill an internal void, I could see and appreciate them for who they truly were, not for what they could do for me. Paradoxically, learning to be happy alone made me more capable of genuine connection when I chose to engage. This points to another counterintuitive truth. Mastering solitude doesn't diminish your capacity for relationship, it enhances it. Those who depend on others for happiness tend to form attachments based on need rather than choice. Their relationships carry the burden of being their primary source of well-being. In contrast, those who can generate happiness independently bring fullness rather than hunger to their connections. They offer presence rather than neediness, appreciation rather than desperate attachment. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer captured this elegantly. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free. This freedom becomes the foundation for authentic happiness, not the fleeting pleasure that comes from external validation, but the sustainable joy that emerges from self-knowledge and self-acceptance. Consider the distinction between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is typically externally triggered, short-lived, and often followed by a return to baseline or even a crash. Happiness, or more accurately, well-being, is an internal state of contentment and meaning that persists independent of circumstances. Our culture excels at offering endless sources of pleasure: social media dopamine hits, consumption opportunities, entertainment options, and social engagements. What it rarely teaches is how to develop the internal resources for lasting happiness. Learning to be happily alone is essentially developing those internal resources, the capacity to generate positive emotions, find meaning, and experience engagement without external stimulation. It's building your happiness muscles rather than renting temporary pleasure. My personal journey revealed specific practices that transformed solitude from something to be endured into something to be treasured. Simple rituals became anchors for my day: morning meditation, mindful tea preparation, evening reflection. These weren't just activities to fill time, they were opportunities to cultivate presence. I discovered that qualitative time alone mattered more than quantitative. 10 minutes of truly present solitude, feeling my breath, noticing sensations, acknowledging thoughts without attachment, did more for my well-being than hours of distracted alone time filled with scrolling and noise. The renowned psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, known for his work on flow states, found that people who learn to control their inner experience are able to determine the quality of their lives regardless of external circumstances. This internal locus of control, the belief that your happiness comes primarily from within rather than from others, is consistently associated with greater life satisfaction across cultures and age groups. Yet developing this internal locus of control requires facing one of humanity's greatest fears, the fear of our own minds. Many people avoid solitude because they're afraid of what they might find when the distractions fall away. What if I'm not who I think I am? What if my thoughts are intolerable? What if the silence reveals emptiness rather than fullness? These fears are natural, even healthy. They mark the beginning of the hero's journey inward. Every meaningful transformation requires facing such dragons. When I first began sitting in silence, uncomfortable truths emerged. I realized how much of my identity had been constructed around being needed by others. I confronted the painful recognition that some of my friends were actually just activity partners, relationships maintained through doing rather than being. I acknowledged the ways I'd used busyness to avoid deeper questions about purpose and meaning. These realizations weren't pleasant, but they were necessary. They cleared space for authentic self-knowledge to emerge. And with that self-knowledge came a surprising gift: self-compassion. Perhaps the most unexpected benefit of my solitude practice was learning to treat myself with the kindness I'd previously reserved for others. Without an audience to perform for, I gradually released the harsh internal critic that had accompanied me for decades. I began to speak to myself as I would to a dear friend, with patience, understanding, and genuine care. This self-compassion became the foundation for everything else. It allowed me to face mistakes without crushing shame. It helped me recognize needs without judgment. It enabled me to set boundaries with others, not from anger, but from genuine self-respect. Research by Dr. Kristin Neff, a pioneer in self-compassion studies, confirms that this internal kindness is strongly associated with psychological well-being, emotional resilience, and yes, happiness. Yet, self-compassion is difficult to develop when we're constantly performing for others, constantly measuring ourselves against external standards. Solitude provides the laboratory where self-compassion can be cultivated. Without the gaze of others, we can practice treating ourselves with the kindness we deserve simply for being human, not for what we achieve or how we appear. This brings us to a fundamental truth that contradicts much of our cultural programming. You are inherently worthy of compassion, respect, and love, including from yourself, regardless of your relationship status, social calendar, or position within any group. This truth is transformative
because it liberates happiness from external conditions. If your worth isn't determined by how others see or value you, then your joy needn't depend on their presence or approval. This is the philosophical foundation of happy solitude. As my journey continued, I began to recognize the difference between constructive solitude and destructive isolation. The former involves intentional time alone for growth, reflection, and renewal. The latter involves withdrawal from connection due to fear, shame, or avoidance. The distinction isn't about how much time you spend alone, but about the quality of that time and the intent behind it. Constructive solitude enriches your relationship with yourself and,
consequently, your connections with others when you choose to engage. Destructive isolation diminishes both. I learned to check my solitude practices with a simple question: is this choice expanding my world or shrinking it? Healthy solitude, paradoxically, expands our internal world, even as it temporarily reduces external stimulation. It increases our capacity for connection rather than diminishing it. This expansion of internal resources, attention, emotional regulation, self-knowledge, creativity, created a foundation for happiness that proved remarkably stable through life's inevitable challenges. When my father became seriously ill the following year, I found I could be fully present with his suffering precisely because I had developed inner resources through solitude. Had this happened during my never alone phase, I would have been frantically texting friends for support, distracting myself from painful emotions, perhaps even avoiding time with him because I couldn't tolerate the discomfort. Instead, having learned to sit with my own difficult feelings in solitude, I could sit with his. The capacity to be with myself translated directly into the capacity to be with others in their need. This points to another counterintuitive benefit of mastering solitude. It can actually make you more effectively compassionate. Those who depend on others for emotional regulation often become overwhelmed by others' pain. Their empathy gets hijacked by personal distress. In contrast, those with strong internal resources can maintain the balanced concern that allows for true compassion without burnout. The psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl recognized this when he wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Solitude practice essentially widens that space between stimulus and response. It increases our capacity to choose rather than merely react. And in that expanded capacity for choice lies profound potential for happiness. This capacity became evident to me in countless daily moments. When a driver cut me off in traffic, I noticed the flare of anger but didn't become it. When a friend cancelled plans, I felt disappointment but could pivot to enjoying unexpected solitude rather than spiraling into rejection stories. When faced with important decisions, I could consult my own values rather than primarily considering others' expectations. Each of these small moments of freedom accumulated into a life that felt increasingly authentic and self-directed. My happiness no longer resembled a roller coaster of reactions to external events, but more closely resembled a steady current that occasionally varied in strength, but never disappeared completely. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies on happiness, found something remarkable after tracking participants for over 80 years. The quality of relationships matters far more for happiness than the quantity. And the quality of your relationships with others depends significantly on the quality of your relationship with yourself. This brings us full circle to the surprising twist that began my journey. Learning to be happily alone isn't about rejecting connection, but about transforming its nature. When you develop the capacity for joyful solitude, you no longer approach relationships from scarcity, but from abundance. You don't need others to complete you. You choose them to complement your already complete self. This shift from needing to choosing is revolutionary. It changes everything about how you connect, whom you connect with, and what those connections feel like from the inside. As we move forward in exploring the foundations of solo happiness, remember this key insight: the capacity for happiness alone isn't just a backup plan for when relationships aren't available. It's the essential foundation upon which all other forms of happiness are built. When you learn to generate joy, peace, and meaning from within, you possess a superpower that transforms not just your solitary hours, but every aspect of your existence. The journey ahead will equip you with specific practices, perspectives, and tools to develop this capacity fully. We'll explore how to build self-awareness, cultivate emotional intelligence, design supportive environments, and create meaningful solo rituals. We'll examine how to navigate social pressure, handle traditional couple-centered occasions, and build a life of purpose, independent of relationship status. But underlying all these practical strategies is the radical truth we've begun to uncover: happiness is an inside job. And learning to be happily alone isn't settling for less. It's accessing the ultimate source of sustainable joy. So let me ask you again, who are you when no one is watching? The journey to answering that question authentically and to loving what you discover is the most important journey you'll ever take. Because no matter how many people surround you throughout your life, you are the only person guaranteed to be with yourself from beginning to end. Learning to enjoy that lifelong companionship isn't just a nice skill, it's the foundation of a truly fulfilling existence. The journey to finding happiness in solitude begins with understanding what we're truly seeking. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how the quietest moments sometimes bring the deepest peace? How the rare instances when external noise fades away can feel like finally taking a deep breath after holding it for too long? This paradox that what we often fear most might actually hold what we most desire lies at the heart of building a foundation for solo happiness. Having explored how my own journey began with that surprising twist at a crowded party, let's now delve deeper into the essential building blocks that transform solitude from something we endure into something we treasure. Words matter profoundly in this journey, so let's begin by addressing the elephant in the room: the critical distinction between being alone and being lonely. These terms are often used interchangeably in everyday conversation, but they represent fundamentally different experiences that affect our brains and bodies in opposite ways. Being alone is simply a physical state, the absence of others. Loneliness, however, is an emotional response characterized by a sense of isolation, disconnection, and the painful feeling that something vital is missing. One is circumstantial, the other is interpretive. One describes your surroundings, the other describes your internal landscape. This distinction isn't merely semantic, it's neurological. Brain imaging studies show that experiencing loneliness activates the same regions associated with physical pain. It triggers stress responses, increases inflammation, and has been linked to higher risks of heart disease, dementia, and premature death. Researchers now consider chronic loneliness as dangerous to health as smoking 15 cigarettes daily. Solitude, by contrast, when embraced rather than feared, activates regions associated with introspection, creativity, and emotional regulation. It can lower stress hormones, enhance focus, and provide the cognitive space needed for meaningful insight. In other words, your brain on healthy solitude looks dramatically different from your brain on loneliness. What determines whether being alone leads to loneliness or solitude? The answer brings us to our first foundational element: self-awareness. the capacity to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with curiosity rather than judgment. Self-awareness serves as the cornerstone of solo happiness because it allows you to recognize what's actually happening within and around you, rather than being swept away by automatic reactions or cultural conditioning. Without self-awareness, we often misinterpret the discomfort of unstructured alone time as evidence that something is wrong, rather than recognizing it as the natural adjustment period it typically represents. Consider what happens when most people find themselves unexpectedly alone after years of constant companionship or distraction. The initial experience often includes restlessness, anxiety, and an urgent desire to fill the space with noise or activity. Without self-awareness, this discomfort gets misinterpreted as confirmation that being alone is inherently unpleasant, rather than recognized as withdrawal from dependence on external stimulation. Developing self-awareness begins with simple practices of noticing what sensations arise in your body when you're alone. Where do you feel tension or ease? What thoughts repeat themselves? What emotions surface? The goal isn't to change anything initially, but simply to observe with the curiosity you might bring to studying an interesting natural phenomenon. My own self-awareness practice began with 5 minutes daily of what I called sensation inventory, meaning systematically noticing physical feelings from head to toe without trying to alter them. This simple practice gradually extended from physical sensations to emotions and thoughts. I discovered patterns I'd never noticed before, how specific thoughts triggered predictable emotional responses, how certain emotional states led to automatic behaviors like reaching for my phone or looking for distraction. This growing self-awareness revealed something startling. Much of my discomfort with solitude wasn't about being alone at all, but about being unfamiliar with myself. The restlessness I experienced wasn't a signal that I needed company. It was my mind's resistance to slowing down enough to face unprocessed emotions and unexamined assumptions. As self-awareness deepens, it naturally develops into the second foundation of solo happiness, emotional intelligence. While self-awareness helps you recognize what you're feeling, emotional intelligence enables you to understand why you feel it and how to respond constructively rather than reactively. Emotional intelligence in solitude involves developing the capacity to be both the experiencer of emotions and their compassionate witness. This dual perspective allows you to feel fully without being completely identified with or overwhelmed by your emotional states. It's the difference between thinking, "I am sad," and recognizing, "I am experiencing sadness at this moment." This subtle shift creates psychological space that transforms how you experience difficult emotions when alone. Without this capacity, challenging feelings like sadness, fear, or anger can seem overwhelming without others to provide distraction or comfort. With developed emotional intelligence, these same feelings become opportunities for deeper self-understanding and growth. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When you name and acknowledge emotions with acceptance rather than resistance, you activate the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, which helps regulate the amygdala's alarm responses. This neural pathway of name it to tame it significantly reduces emotional intensity and creates the conditions for working with rather than against your emotional experience. Developing this capacity begins with expanding your emotional vocabulary beyond basic labels like good, bad, fine, or stressed. Can you distinguish between disappointment and discouragement, between contentment and joy, between nervousness and anticipation? The more precise your emotional language, the more effectively you can understand and regulate your internal experience. I created what I called an emotion wheel journal, where I tracked subtle variations in my emotional states throughout days spent alone.
This practice revealed that what I had previously labeled as loneliness was actually a complex constellation of different feelings. Sometimes it was simple boredom, other times nostalgia, occasionally genuine social hunger, and frequently the discomfort of facing parts of myself I'd been avoiding through constant activity. This emotional granularity transformed my experience by making feelings less mysterious and overwhelming. It allowed me to respond appropriately to specific needs, rather than assuming any discomfort while alone meant I needed company. Sometimes I did need connection, but often I needed something entirely different: creative expression, physical movement,
intellectual stimulation, or simply patience as uncomfortable emotions completed their natural cycle. This brings us to the third foundation of solo happiness: self-regulation. The ability to manage your internal states rather than being managed by them. Self-regulation doesn't mean suppressing emotions or forcing yourself to think positive. Instead, it means developing a flexible repertoire of strategies for working with your emotions and thoughts productively. When we lack self-regulation skills, being alone can become overwhelming because there's no external system helping to stabilize our internal states. We've never developed the capacity to soothe ourselves, motivate ourselves, or shift our perspectives without outside intervention. This dependency creates a fundamental barrier to solo happiness. Effective self-regulation involves three core capacities: the ability to soothe yourself when distressed, energize yourself when depleted, and focus yourself when scattered. These skills aren't innate. They're developed through practice and become more accessible with repetition. Self-soothing might involve physical strategies like deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or gentle movement. It could include sensory practices like taking a warm bath, wrapping yourself in a soft blanket, or playing calming music. Or it might utilize cognitive approaches like perspective taking, self-compassionate self-talk, or mindfulness practices. The key is developing a personalized toolkit of strategies that work reliably for your unique nervous system. Through trial and error, I discovered that physical movement was my most effective regulation strategy during intense emotions. A brisk walk for anxiety, gentle stretching for sadness, vigorous exercise for frustration. Others might find greater benefit in creative expression, meditation, or structured problem solving. What matters isn't which specific strategies you use, but that you have multiple options and the self-awareness to match the right approach to your current state. This flexibility prevents the common scenario where being alone with difficult emotions feels intolerable because you have no way to influence your internal experience. Self-regulation extends beyond managing difficult emotions to include generating positive states independently. In relationships and social settings, we often outsource this function, relying on others to make us laugh, motivate us, or provide stimulation. Developing the capacity to inspire yourself, amuse yourself, and create your own meaningful experiences is essential for sustainable solo happiness. I began deliberately practicing what I called state generation by identifying activities that reliably produced specific positive emotions for me. Reading certain poets consistently evoked wonder. Working with my hands on small projects created flow and satisfaction. Planning future adventures sparked anticipation and excitement. These weren't distractions but intentional practices for cultivating desired mental and emotional states. This capacity for generating positive states independently represents a profound form of self-reliance. It transforms alone time from something to be endured into an opportunity for chosen experiences. Rather than waiting for happiness to arrive from external sources, you learn to create it intentionally through your own agency. The fourth foundation builds upon these emotional capacities: cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspectives, question assumptions, and think in nuanced rather than rigid ways. This mental agility is particularly crucial for solo happiness because our thoughts about being alone profoundly influence our experience of it. Consider the different emotional outcomes generated by these alternative thought patterns. I'm alone because no one wants to be with me, versus I'm enjoying solitude as a chosen experience. Or Friday nights alone mean I'm failing at life, versus Friday nights alone provide unique opportunities for restoration and self-connection. Same circumstance, radically different experience based entirely on cognitive framing. Our minds naturally gravitate toward negative interpretations of solitude because of evolutionary bias toward detecting threats. For our ancestors, separation from the group represented genuine danger, so our brains developed strong negative associations with being alone. These associations persist even when solitude poses no actual threat in modern contexts. Developing cognitive flexibility allows you to recognize and challenge these automatic negative interpretations. It involves identifying common thought distortions like catastrophizing, say your being alone means I'll always be alone, mind reading, say your people think I'm a loser for being by myself, or emotional reasoning, so you'll be a Duckworth. I feel uncomfortable alone, therefore being alone is harmful. One powerful practice for developing this flexibility is the thought record technique from cognitive behavioral therapy. When you notice distress related to being alone, you document the situation, your automatic thoughts, and the emotions these thoughts generate. Then you examine the evidence for and against these thoughts, consider alternative perspectives, and formulate more balanced viewpoints. Through consistent practice with this approach, I gradually replaced catastrophic interpretations of solitude with more accurate and helpful perspectives. No one invited me out tonight, transformed from evidence of my inherent unlovability into the simple recognition that social connections ebb and flow naturally, creating space for different kinds of experiences. This cognitive shift didn't deny genuine feelings, but placed them in a more proportionate and constructive context. This cognitive flexibility extends to challenging cultural narratives about solitude. We're surrounded by messages equating social abundance with success and portraying solo activities as consolation prizes. Movies rarely show protagonists happily attending events alone or taking solo vacations without a romantic resolution. Literature seldom celebrates the joys of solitude without framing it as a temporary state before the real story of connection begins. Recognizing these narratives as constructed rather than inevitable truths creates freedom to write your own story about what makes a life meaningful and well-lived. It allows you to question whether constant togetherness actually delivers on its promises, and whether solitude might offer gifts our culture rarely acknowledges. The fifth foundation integrates these cognitive and emotional capacities: self-compassion. The practice of treating yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and support you would offer a good friend. Self-compassion transforms the internal relationship that shapes every moment of solo experience, replacing the harsh inner critic with a wise, supportive inner ally. This inner relationship profoundly influences whether solitude feels like punishment or privilege. Without self-compassion, alone time often becomes an exercise in self-judgment, a space where the critical voice gains volume without external distractions to muffle it. With developed self-compassion, solitude becomes a sanctuary for self-connection and genuine acceptance. Dr. Kristin Neff, the pioneering researcher in this field, identifies three components of self-compassion: mindfulness of suffering, noticing pain without exaggerating or suppressing it; common humanity, recognizing that struggle is part of shared human experience rather than evidence of personal failure; and self-kindness, offering warmth and understanding to yourself rather than harsh criticism. Developing these qualities begins with noticing the tone of your internal dialogue, particularly during challenging moments alone. Do you speak to yourself with the harshness you would never direct towards someone you love? Do you magnify normal human imperfections into evidence of fundamental unworthiness? Do you treat your own suffering as less legitimate than others? My own practice involved keeping a self-talk journal where I recorded my automatic internal responses to mistakes, disappointments, and struggles. The patterns were revealing and disturbing. I discovered that my self-directed language contained criticism I would never express to anyone else, expectations of perfection I would never impose on others, and a fundamental assumption that my worth required continual proving. Gradually, I began responding to these harsh inner statements with the question, what would I say to someone I love in this situation? This simple redirection consistently generated more balanced, helpful, and kind perspectives. Over time, this compassionate voice grew stronger, eventually becoming my default, rather than requiring conscious effort to access. This self-compassionate stance creates the emotional safety needed to face whatever arises in solitude without resorting to avoidance or distraction. When being with your own thoughts feels like facing a harsh judge, alone time naturally becomes threatening. When being with your thoughts means encountering understanding and support, solitude becomes inviting. The sixth foundation builds upon this self-compassionate base: purposeful solitude, the practice of approaching alone time as an opportunity for chosen activities rather than empty space to fill. While unstructured time certainly has value, intentionally designing solitude around meaningful pursuits transforms it from potential void into fertile ground for growth, creativity, and fulfillment. Purposeful solitude involves identifying activities that generate four key experiences: flow, absorbing engagement that creates a sense of timelessness; mastery, developing skills that provide a sense of competence and progress; meaning, connecting with values and purposes larger than immediate pleasure; and play, engagement for its own sake with curiosity and joy. These experiences provide the vital psychological nutrients that make solitude not merely tolerable but genuinely nourishing. They shift the experience from passive waiting for time to pass to active creation of meaningful experience. They answer the essential question, what becomes possible specifically because I'm alone right now? For me, writing became a cornerstone of purposeful solitude, an activity perfectly suited to the focused attention that solitude provides. I discovered that my creative voice emerged more authentically without the subtle adjustments I made when writing with awareness of immediate audience. The uninterrupted flow available in extended solitude allowed me to reach depths impossible in fragmented time. This wasn't about using productivity to justify solitude or distracting myself from being alone. Rather, it was recognizing that certain valuable experiences become accessible precisely because of solitude's unique qualities: the absence of performance pressure, the continuity of attention, the freedom from external rhythms and expectations. Different forms of purposeful solitude serve different needs. Creative solitude channels expression and brings inner life into tangible form. Reflective solitude creates space for meaning-making and integration of experience. Adventurous solitude expands comfort zones and builds self-reliance. Restorative solitude allows for deep rest and natural healing processes.
What matters isn't the specific form your purposeful solitude takes, but that it aligns with your authentic interests rather than imposed shoulds. The activities that constitute nourishing solitude vary tremendously between individuals. One person's meditative bliss is another's restless boredom. Discovering your personal patterns requires experimentation and attentive tracking of what genuinely engages versus what merely occupies you. This discovery process leads to the seventh foundation: personalized rituals, regular practices that create structure, meaning, and anticipation in solo time. Rituals differ from routine habits in their intentional symbolism and meaning. They aren't merely efficient ways to accomplish necessary tasks, but acts that connect you to deeper values, mark transitions, or create sacred space in ordinary time. In the absence of social structures that naturally punctuate time and create moments of significance, personal rituals become especially valuable for solo happiness. They transform unmarked time into experiences with narrative shape and meaning. They create occasions to anticipate rather than endure.
My morning ritual evolved to include elements specifically chosen for their effects on my state: brief meditation to center attention, journaling to clarify thoughts, movement to energize my body, and setting 3 intentions for the day ahead. This wasn't about rigid self-discipline, but about intentionally creating a container that supported the kind of day I wanted to experience. Evening rituals proved equally important, providing closure to the day and transition into restful solitude. Making a cup of special tea, reviewing moments of beauty or meaning noticed during the day, and setting out what I needed for the next morning became symbolic acts of self-care rather than merely practical tasks. Seasonal and annual rituals add larger rhythms to solo living: personal celebrations of significant dates, traditions marking natural transitions, practices acknowledging accomplishments or beginnings. These create the sense of meaningful time often provided by social and cultural structures, but shaped precisely to your own values and preferences. The beauty of personal rituals is their perfect customization. Unlike social customs that necessarily involve compromise, solo rituals can precisely match your preferences, energy patterns, and values. They become expressions of self-knowledge and self-care rather than obligations to meet external expectations. These 7 foundations: self-awareness, emotional intelligence, self-regulation, cognitive flexibility, self-compassion, purposeful solitude, and personal rituals, create the infrastructure for sustainable solo happiness. They work synergistically, each strengthening the others while addressing different aspects of the solitude experience. Yet, even with these foundations in place, we must address an 8th element crucial for thriving alone: environmental design. The intentional creation of physical spaces that support well-being, functionality, and pleasure. Our surroundings profoundly influence our mental states, particularly when we spend significant time in them alone. The spaces we inhabit aren't merely backgrounds to our experience, but active participants in shaping our emotions, behaviors, and thought patterns. A chaotic, uncomfortable, or depressing environment makes solo happiness unnecessarily difficult, while thoughtfully designed spaces can facilitate self-connection, creativity, and peace. This doesn't require lavish homes or expensive renovations. Simple adjustments make profound differences: clearing clutter that creates visual noise and mental distraction, establishing defined areas for different activities that help maintain healthy boundaries between work, rest, and play, incorporating elements that engage multiple senses pleasurably, ensuring adequate natural light, which directly impacts mood regulation. I transformed my living space from a place I merely occupied to one that actively supported my well-being through deliberate choices. I created a dedicated meditation corner with objects that held personal meaning, established a comfortable reading nook positioned to capture afternoon light, and designed my bedroom exclusively for rest rather than work or entertainment. These distinctions help my environment support state shifts rather than confusing my system with mixed signals. Beyond functional zones, I incorporated elements specifically chosen for their sensory and emotional impact: plants that brought living presence, art that evoked desired states, fabrics with pleasing textures, soundscapes that created appropriate atmospheres for different activities. These weren't indulgences but strategic choices to create an environment that actively contributed to well-being rather than subtly undermining it. This environmental awareness extends beyond home spaces to include thoughtful selection of public environments. Rather than randomly filling time outside the home, I began deliberately choosing locations based on their effects on my state: certain cafes conducive to focused work, parks that facilitated contemplation, museums that inspired creativity. This transformed random outings into intentional experiences supporting specific aims. The ninth foundation addresses what may be the most challenging aspect of solo happiness: relationship with time. Our experience of time profoundly changes when we're alone, often becoming either oppressively slow or disconcertingly unstructured. Developing a healthy relationship with temporal experience is essential for sustainable solitude. In constant companionship or activity, time typically passes without much conscious awareness. Conversations, obligations, and interactions create natural divisions and forward momentum. In solitude, we confront time directly, sometimes experiencing the discomfort of duration when minutes seem to stretch endlessly, or the disorientation of unstructured time when hours blur together without external markers. Developing comfort with unstructured time involves recognizing the distinction between empty time and open time. Empty time feels meaningless and aversive, hours to get through rather than experience. Open time feels spacious and potential-filled, an opportunity for emergent experience rather than predetermined activity. Same duration, entirely different quality based on perception and approach. My practice involved gradually extending periods of what I called agendaless time blocks, where I set aside plans and productive intentions to simply be with whatever emerged. Initially uncomfortable, these periods gradually became treasured opportunities for spontaneous discovery, creative insight, and deep rest inaccessible through structured activity. This comfort with open time doesn't mean abandoning temporal structure entirely. Rather, it means developing the capacity to move fluidly between different temporal experiences: focused concentration, open awareness, structured activity, and unplanned exploration based on genuine needs rather than avoidance of discomfort. The rhythms that emerge from this flexible relationship with time typically differ from conventional schedules designed around workplace expectations or social norms. Solo rhythms tend to align more closely with natural energy cycles, seasonal patterns, and individual chronobiology. This alignment itself contributes significantly to well-being by reducing the friction between imposed schedules and natural functioning. The 10th foundation integrates temporal awareness with the previous elements, balancing structure and freedom. The art of creating sufficient organization to prevent disorientation while allowing adequate space for spontaneity and organic development. This balance represents one of the most nuanced skills in solo living, requiring ongoing adjustment rather than fixed formulas. Too much structure in solitude creates rigidity and mechanical living. Days become predictable executions of plans rather than lived experiences. Too little structure creates anxiety and ineffectiveness. Energy dissipates without channeling systems, and important needs may go unmet without intentional attention. Finding your personal balance point involves experimentation with different approaches to organizing time, energy, and attention. Some discover they need more explicit structure when alone than they initially assumed. The accountability and direction previously provided externally must be replaced with intentional systems. Others find they need less structure than cultural messaging suggests. Their natural rhythms emerge more effectively with minimal organization. My own balance evolved through seasons, certain periods calling for more defined schedules during project completion or skill development, others benefiting from more open-ended exploration during creative phases or recovery periods. The key was developing the self-awareness to recognize which approach served current needs, rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all system. This flexibility extends to balancing different life dimensions: work, rest, recreation, connection, creativity, and learning. In solitude, the responsibility for maintaining this balance rests entirely with you, rather than being partially distributed through relationships and social structures. This requires regular review and adjustment to prevent overemphasis in certain areas at the expense of others. I developed a simple weekly practice I called Life Wheel Review, assessing satisfaction across 8 life dimensions and adjusting the coming week's focus based on what needed attention. This prevented the common imbalances of solo living, overworking without social boundaries, excessive rumination without external perspective, neglecting physical needs without accountability partners. The 11th foundation addresses the social dimension directly: selective connection, the art of cultivating meaningful relationships that enhance rather than determine your well-being. This foundation recognizes that thriving in solitude doesn't mean rejecting human connection, but approaching it from sufficiency rather than deficiency. The quality of social connections profoundly influences solo happiness. Relationships based on genuine affinity and mutual respect enhance solitary time, while depleting interactions can make returning to solitude feel like necessary recovery rather than chosen pleasure. This makes discernment in relationship formation and maintenance particularly important for those embracing solitude as a significant life element. Selective connection involves several shifts in approach to relationships. First, it means choosing quality over quantity, investing in fewer, deeper connections rather than maintaining numerous superficial ones. Second, it involves prioritizing authenticity over accommodation, seeking relationships where you can be fully yourself rather than performing to maintain connection. Third, it means establishing clear boundaries that protect your solo time as valuable rather than apologizing for it as a deficiency. My own social circle transformed dramatically through this process, becoming smaller but significantly more nourishing. I developed what I called relationship intention statements for key connections, clarifying what each uniquely offered and required, and ensuring alignment between these realities and my capacity. This reduced the friction of mismatched expectations and created space for relationships to develop according to their natural qualities rather than predetermined scripts. This selective approach extends to digital connection as well. Social media and communication technologies offer unprecedented options for maintaining contact without physical presence, yet often create the paradoxical effect of increasing rather than decreasing loneliness. Mindful digital engagement involves using these tools in ways that genuinely enhance connection rather than substitute for it or create unhelpful social comparison. I established specific technology practices that supported healthy solitude rather than undermining it, designating certain days as digital sabbaticals free from social platforms, creating boundaries around when I engaged with communication tools, and periodically reviewing how different forms of digital connection
affected my actual experience rather than my fear of missing out. These practices revealed that my anxiety about disconnecting significantly exceeded the actual value of constant availability. The freed attention and emotional energy from reduced digital immersion created space for deeper forms of both solitude and connection, fully present time alone, and fully engaged interaction when choosing to connect. The 12th foundation synthesizes these various elements into a coherent whole personal philosophy, developing an articulated understanding of what constitutes a well-lived life according to your authentic values rather than inherited assumptions. This explicit philosophy provides the context that makes choices about solitude and connection meaningful rather than merely reactive. Without an examined personal philosophy, decisions about how to live often default to unconscious cultural programming that may not align with your actual values or temperament. The unexamined assumption that happiness requires constant companionship represents one such programming element that deserves critical evaluation rather than automatic acceptance.
Developing a personal philosophy involves asking fundamental questions. What constitutes genuine success in your view? What elements must be present for a day to feel well lived? What values do you want your choices to express? What forms of growth matter most to you? How do you define enough in various life dimensions? My own philosophical development involved creating what I called a wisdom council, a collection of perspectives from thinkers, traditions, and approaches that resonated with my deepest intuitions about what matters. This wasn't about adopting any single system wholesale, but synthesizing diverse wisdom into a coherent approach aligned with my unique constellation of values and circumstances. This philosophical foundation provides the context for making meaningful choices in solitude. Without it, alone time easily defaults to either mindless distraction or productive busyness, activities that occupy hours without creating genuine fulfillment. With an articulated philosophy, solitude becomes an opportunity to embody chosen values through deliberate presence and intentional action. These 12 foundations, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, self-regulation, cognitive flexibility, self-compassion, purposeful solitude, personal rituals, environmental design, relationship with time, balancing structure and freedom, selective connection, and personal philosophy create the comprehensive infrastructure for sustainable solo happiness. They address the psychological, practical, environmental, temporal, relational, and philosophical dimensions necessary for thriving alone. Yet foundational elements alone don't create sustainable structures without connective material binding them together. The mortar that unites these foundations into a cohesive whole is integration, the ongoing practice of weaving these elements into daily living through consistent attention and application. Integration happens through regular reflection on how these foundations manifest in your actual experience. It involves noticing connections between them, how self-awareness enhances emotional regulation, how environmental design supports purposeful solitude, how personal philosophy informs selective connection. These interconnections create a resilient system rather than isolated practices. My integration practice evolved around 3 questions reviewed each evening. What supported my well-being in solitude today? What challenged it? What adjustments would strengthen my foundation tomorrow? This simple reflection prevented the common pattern where initial enthusiasm for new approaches fades without consistent reinforcement and refinement. Integration also involves recognizing seasons and cycles in your relationship with solitude. Some periods naturally call for more social engagement, others for deeper retreat. Some projects require intense focus. Others benefit from spacious incubation. Some emotional states invite companionship. Others heal more effectively through solitary processing. Integration means honoring these natural variations rather than forcing a single approach across all circumstances. The capacity for happy solitude doesn't develop linearly but spirally, returning to similar challenges with greater resources and deeper understanding each time. Initial periods of comfortable solitude may be followed by unexpected difficulty when new layers of psychological material emerge for processing. Integration means recognizing these cycles as natural development rather than regression. This developmental perspective reveals perhaps the most important truth about solo happiness. It's not a destination, but an ongoing practice that evolves throughout your lifetime. The capacity grows stronger with consistent attention while remaining responsive to changing circumstances and emerging needs. What brings joy in solitude at the 30th of May differ from what nourishes at 50 or 70, yet the foundational capacities for generating well-being independently remain valuable throughout these changes. As we prepare to explore specific strategies for solo living in our next section, carry forward this essential understanding: the foundations we've explored aren't theoretical concepts, but lived practices that develop through consistent application in your actual experience. They represent skills rather than traits, capacities you cultivate rather than qualities you either have or lack. This developmental framework offers profound hope. If happiness in solitude were an innate trait, those who struggle initially would face permanent limitation. Because it's a set of learnable skills built on understandable principles, the capacity for solo happiness remains accessible regardless of your starting point. With appropriate foundations and consistent practice, the ability to generate well-being independently becomes increasingly natural, transforming solitude from something you endure into something you treasure. The journey from fear of being alone to freedom in solitude doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds through thousands of small choices, practices, and insights that gradually reshape your relationship with yourself and your experience of time spent in your own company. The foundations we've explored provide the infrastructure for this transformation, creating the conditions where solo happiness can naturally emerge and flourish. As we move forward to explore practical strategies for daily solo living, we'll build upon these foundations with specific approaches for designing environments, activities, and routines that transform solitude from an absence to a presence, not the lack of others but the fullness of self-connection and chosen experience. These foundations make such practical strategies effective rather than superficial, creating the internal conditions where external practices can take root and flourish. What if your home became a sanctuary rather than just a place to sleep? What if your daily routines transformed into rituals of self-connection rather than just tasks to complete? What if solitude became a canvas for creation rather than empty space to fill? Having established the psychological foundations that make solo happiness possible, let's now translate these principles into practical strategies that transform daily living. The gap between understanding concepts and embodying them in everyday life is where many solo journeys falter. Knowledge alone doesn't create change, implementation does. So let's bridge theory and practice with specific approaches that make solo happiness a lived reality rather than an abstract ideal. The environment you create around yourself profoundly influences your experience of solitude. Your physical spaces aren't merely backgrounds to your life, but active participants in shaping your emotions, behaviors, and thought patterns. Designing these spaces intentionally creates the container that supports your well-being when alone. Consider your current living space. Does it energize or deplete you? Does it reflect your authentic preferences or inherited assumptions about how homes should look? Does it facilitate the activities that bring you joy or create friction around them? Is it organized to support your natural rhythms or working against them? These questions matter because environmental friction creates unnecessary difficulty in solo living. When your space fights your intentions rather than supporting them, maintaining positive states alone requires constant effort that eventually depletes willpower. Conversely, when your environment naturally facilitates your chosen activities and states, solo happiness becomes the path of least resistance rather than something requiring continuous effort. Creating a supportive environment begins with decluttering not just physical objects but visual, auditory and digital noise that fragments attention and creates subtle stress. This doesn't mean embracing minimalism unless that aesthetic resonates with you, but rather ensuring that what occupies your space serves your well-being rather than depleting it. My own decluttering process involved asking 3 questions about everything in my environment. Does this bring me genuine joy or utility? Does this support the person I'm becoming or anchor me to outdated versions of myself? Would I choose this again today if I didn't already own it? These questions revealed how many possessions remained in my space through inertia rather than intention, creating subtle drains on attention and energy. Beyond decluttering, intentional environment design involves creating distinct zones for different activities and states. Rather than multi-purpose spaces that blur boundaries between work, rest, creativity, and contemplation, defined areas support clear transitions between different modes of being. This distinction becomes especially important in smaller living spaces where physical separation between activities may be limited. Even in my one-bedroom apartment, I established clear boundaries between zones through simple visual cues and furniture arrangement, a comfortable chair specifically for reading, a designated meditation cushion never used for other purposes, a table reserved exclusively for creative projects rather than doubling as a dining surface. These distinctions help my nervous system recognize transitions between different activities without relying on external cues from others. The sensory dimensions of your environment significantly impact state regulation when alone. Lighting profoundly affects mood and energy, with natural light particularly important for regulating circadian rhythms and neurotransmitter production. Sound shapes attention and emotional tone, whether through deliberate music choices, natural ambient noise, or intentional silence. Temperature, scent, and texture create multi-sensory feedback that either supports or undermines comfort in solitude. I developed what I called state playlists for different activities and moods, not just music, but coordinated combinations of lighting, sound, scent, and spatial arrangement designed to facilitate specific experiences. My morning writing environment included soft indirect lighting, instrumental music with specific tempo characteristics, gentle background scents, and a particular seating arrangement that I used only for this purpose. This sensory consistency created a reliable entry point into creative flow that didn't depend on unpredictable inspiration or external stimulation. This environmental design extends beyond your home to include thoughtful selection of public spaces that support rather than undermine solo well-being. Not all public environments are equally conducive to comfortable solitude. Some cafes, parks, museums, libraries, and community spaces naturally facilitate being pleasantly alone in the presence of others, while others create awkward self-consciousness or unhelpful social comparison. I developed a personal map of solo-friendly locations in my city, places where I could comfortably spend time alone without feeling out of place or conspicuous. This included cafes with appropriate table arrangements and ambient noise levels, parks with both open and secluded areas,
museums with bench placement conducive to prolonged contemplation, and community spaces where solo visitors were normalized rather than unusual. This environmental curation isn't about avoiding all discomfort or creating perfectly controlled conditions. Rather, it's about reducing unnecessary friction so your energy can focus on meaningful engagement rather than overcoming environmental obstacles. The goal is making solo happiness the path of least resistance by aligning your surroundings with your intentions. While environmental design creates the container for solo living, daily rituals provide the structure that transforms unorganized time into meaningful experience. In the absence of external schedules imposed by relationships or social obligations, personal rituals become essential anchors that prevent the formlessness that often makes solitude initially disorienting. Morning rituals deserve particular attention because they set the trajectory for hours that follow. Rather than beginning days with immediate digital immersion or reactive responding to others' priorities, intentional morning sequences create space for self-connection before engagement with the external world. These don't need to be elaborate or time-consuming. Even 10 minutes of deliberate practice significantly influences what follows.
My own morning ritual evolved through experimentation to include 5 elements that reliably supported positive states. A moment of gratitude immediately upon waking, physical movement before digital engagement, consumption of something nourishing before checking communications, setting 3 specific intentions for the day, and briefly visualizing these intentions manifesting. This sequence took less than 20 minutes, but dramatically shifted my experience from reactive to intentional days. Evening rituals prove equally important for healthy solo living, creating closure to days and facilitating the transition into restful solitude. Without the natural endpoint that often comes from others in shared living situations, days can blur indefinitely without clear boundaries. Intentional evening practices create psychological completion that allows for genuine renewal. My evening ritual included a brief review of the day's meaningful moments, specifically avoiding both accomplishment checklist thinking and rumination on perceived failures. Preparation of physical spaces for morning activities, disconnection from screens at least 30 minutes before sleep, and a short reading period with specifically chosen material that promoted contemplative rather than stimulating states. This sequence reliably improved sleep quality and prevented the evening drifting that often occurs without external time boundaries. Between these bookend rituals, micro-transitions throughout the day maintain state regulation and prevent the monotony that can characterize undifferentiated solo time. These brief practices, as short as 30 seconds, create punctuation in otherwise continuous experience, allowing for reset and renewal rather than gradual depletion across extended periods of solitude. Effective micro-transitions involve state shifts across multiple channels: physical position, breath pattern, attention focus, sensory input. Simply standing and stretching while taking 3 deep breaths between activities creates enough pattern interruption to prevent state dragging, where the residual energy of one activity contaminates the next. More elaborate transitions might include brief movement sequences, sensory resets using cold water or scent, or momentary mindfulness practices. My personal system included transition bells programmed at specific intervals as external reminders to implement these micro-shifts. This prevented the common experience of emerging from hours of solitude, feeling depleted or disconnected from physical needs, a phenomenon often misinterpreted as evidence that being alone is inherently draining, rather than recognizing it as the result of insufficient state management. Beyond daily structures, weekly rhythms provide the larger architecture that prevents solo time from becoming an undifferentiated blur. In traditional arrangements, Weekends typically create natural variation through social engagements and shared activities. In self-directed solo living, intentionally designing different qualities into different days creates necessary diversity of experience. This doesn't mean rigidly assigning specific activities to specific days, but rather creating qualitative differences between days to prevent monotony. Some days might emphasize productivity and focused work, others creativity and exploration, others rest and integration, others connection and relationship. This variation prevents the common experience of all days feeling identical in solitude. I developed what I called day theming rather than rigid scheduling, assigning primary qualities to different days while allowing specific activities to emerge responsively. My Mondays emphasized structure and implementation, Wednesdays creative exploration, Fridays completion and integration, Sundays spaciousness and rest. This framework provided direction without constraint, creating helpful variation while honoring changing needs and circumstances. Monthly and seasonal practices create even larger rhythms that prevent solo living from becoming static or repetitive. Regular review periods, whether monthly, quarterly, or aligned with natural seasons, provide opportunities to assess what's working, what needs adjustment, and what new experiments or practices might enhance your solo experience. These larger rhythms often benefit from location changes that provide novel input and perspective. Even short geographic shifts, a weekend in a different environment, a day trip to an unfamiliar location, or simply working from a new space, can interrupt habitual patterns and introduce fresh energy into solo routines that might otherwise become stale through repetition. My seasonal practice included a 2-day solo retreat each quarter, ideally in natural settings different from my daily environment. These brief immersions served multiple purposes, providing perspective on ongoing patterns, creating space for deeper reflection than daily life typically allows, and introducing environmental novelty that stimulated fresh thinking and perception. The contrast between these periodic intensives and regular routines created beneficial tension that prevented stagnation. Beyond temporal structuring, solo happiness requires active nutrition across multiple dimensions of well-being. Just as physical health demands regular inputs of various nutrients, psychological and emotional health requires consistent inputs that are easily overlooked without the external reminders that relationships often provide. Physical well-being forms the foundation upon which all other dimensions rest. In shared living situations, others often function as external regulators for basic needs, reminding you to eat, noticing when you're tired, suggesting movement when you've been sedentary too long. In solitude, these regulatory functions must be internalized through consistent attention and systems that support, rather than override, bodily needs. Effective systems might include scheduled movement breaks that interrupt sedentary periods, meal planning that ensures consistent nourishment rather than reactive eating, and sleep hygiene practices that support regular rest cycles. These aren't rigid controls but supportive structures that facilitate attention to needs easily overlooked during absorbed solo activity. My physical well-being system centered around what I called body check-ins, brief moments throughout the day when I systematically assessed hunger, thirst, tension, energy, and temperature without judgment or immediate problem-solving. This simple practice dramatically increased my awareness of physical needs before they became urgent, preventing the boom-bust cycle of ignoring bodily signals until they became impossible to overlook. Intellectual stimulation requires equally deliberate attention in solitude. Without the natural cognitive diversity that comes from regular interaction with different minds, solo living can lead to intellectual stagnation or excessive rumination within familiar thought patterns. Intentional practices that introduce novel ideas, challenge existing perspectives, and stimulate different thinking modes become essential for mental vitality. Effective approaches might include curated information diets that introduce diverse viewpoints rather than reinforcing existing positions, structured learning projects that provide progressive challenge rather than comfortable review of known territory, or deliberate exposure to fields outside your primary expertise to stimulate cross-disciplinary thinking. My intellectual nutrition system included what I called curiosity pathways, structured but open-ended explorations of topics that naturally engaged my interest without immediate practical application. This prevented my thinking from becoming exclusively utilitarian or narrowly focused on productive outcomes, creating space for the intellectual play essential for creative insight and mental flexibility. Creative expression holds particular importance in solo happiness, providing vital channels for externalization of internal experience. Without regular outlets for creative energy, solitude can become a closed loop of consumption and analysis rather than generative engagement with life. Regular creative practice, regardless of skill level or practical outcome, creates necessary movement between inner and outer worlds. Effective creative practice isn't about producing impressive work, but about engaging the fundamental human capacity to bring something new into existence. This might involve traditional arts like writing, music, or visual expression, but equally includes cooking, gardening, space arrangement, problem solving, or any activity where you actively shape materials or ideas rather than merely consuming them. My creative commitment involved 20 minutes of non-judged creation daily, time specifically designated for making something without evaluation or purpose beyond the act itself. This simple practice shifted my relationship with creativity from product orientation to process engagement, eliminating the perfectionism that often blocks expression and creating regular experience of flow states regardless of external validation. Sensory pleasure represents another dimension requiring intentional attention in solitude. Without others to suggest sensory experiences or share enjoyment, deliberate cultivation of physical pleasure through the senses prevents the diminished sensory engagement that can characterize isolated living. This isn't about hedonism, but about maintaining full embodied presence in your physical existence. Effective sensory practices involve mindful engagement with everyday experiences rather than requiring extraordinary circumstances. Truly tasting food rather than eating distractedly, feeling the physical sensations of movement rather than exercising mechanically, noticing the play of light and color in ordinary environments, attending to textures and temperatures encountered throughout daily activities. These simple awareness shifts transform mundane moments into sources of genuine pleasure. My sensory practice centered around what I called pleasure pauses, brief moments throughout the day when I intentionally amplified attention to pleasant sensory input already present in my environment. This practice counteracted the negativity bias that naturally inclines attention toward problems or discomforts, creating balanced awareness that included the many sources of sensory enjoyment continuously available but easily overlooked. Beyond these fundamental dimensions, sustainable solo happiness requires engagement with transcendent elements that connect individual experience to larger contexts and meanings. Without this connection to something beyond personal concerns, solitude can become self-referential and ultimately limiting rather than expansive. Nature connection provides one of the most accessible transcendent experiences, offering perspective that reduces excessive self-focus while stimulating awe, wonder, and humility.
emotions consistently linked to psychological well-being in research studies. Regular immersion in natural environments, whether wilderness areas, urban parks, or even attentive observation of natural processes in highly developed settings, creates necessary counterbalance to the self-contained environments that often characterize modern solo living. My nature practice included what I called threshold experiences, intentionally placing myself at interfaces between different natural elements like shorelines, forest edges, or elevation changes. These boundary zones typically feature increased ecological diversity and create natural metaphors for psychological thresholds between different states or perspectives, stimulating both sensory richness and contemplative insight. Contemplative practices similarly connect individual experience to larger contexts through attention to fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and reality. Whether through formal meditation, philosophical reflection, spiritual inquiry, or secular contemplation of existential questions, regular engagement with perspectives beyond immediate concerns prevents the narrowing of focus that can characterize isolated thinking. Effective contemplative practice doesn't require specific religious or philosophical commitments, but rather engagement with questions that transcend purely personal interests. What gives meaning to human experience? How should we understand suffering and impermanence? What constitutes a well-lived life? What responsibilities accompany human consciousness?
Consideration of such questions expands perspective beyond immediate circumstances, creating psychological spaciousness. My contemplative approach centered around what I called philosophical walks, physical movement, combined with focused consideration of specific questions drawn from diverse wisdom traditions. This combination of embodied activity with conceptual exploration created a balance that prevented both excessive abstraction and mindless rumination, generating insights that emerged from integrated rather than purely intellectual engagement. Service and contribution create another vital connection beyond individual concerns, preventing the self-absorption that can develop in prolonged solitude. Regular engagement in activities that benefit others without primary focus on personal gain creates meaning, perspective, and social connection that transcends both isolation and mere networking for personal advantage. Effective service doesn't require grand gestures or formal volunteer positions, but rather an orientation toward contribution in everyday contexts. This might involve offering skills to community projects, supporting causes aligned with your values, mentoring others in areas of competence, or simply approaching regular interactions with genuine consideration for others' well-being, rather than exclusive focus on personal benefit. My service commitment included dedicating one weekend monthly to projects benefiting others without compensation or recognition. This practice wasn't about accumulating virtue or social credit, but about maintaining balanced perspective between self-development and outward contribution, a balance easily distorted in highly individualized solo living without deliberate counterbalancing practices. These various dimensions, physical, intellectual, creative, sensory, transcendent, and contributory, require integration through reflection practices that connect isolated experiences into coherent understanding. Without regular reflection, even the most well-designed solo lifestyle can become fragmentary rather than unified, missing the connections between different elements that create synergistic rather than merely additive benefits. Effective reflection isn't about rigid self-analysis or forced meaning-making, but rather creating space for natural integration through practices that invite rather than demand insight. Journaling without predetermined structure, contemplative walking without specific agenda, creative expression without defined outcome, these open-ended approaches often reveal connections and patterns not accessible through more directed thinking. My integration practice centered around what I called synthesis sessions, periodic blocks of unstructured time specifically designated for allowing connections to emerge between different experiences, ideas, and practices. These sessions typically involve physical movement, visual mapping tools, and alternation between focused and diffuse attention states to activate different cognitive modes that together generated insights unavailable through linear analysis alone. While these various practices and systems might initially seem complex or demanding, they ultimately create simplicity rather than complication. Clear structures paradoxically enable greater freedom by eliminating the constant decision-making and willpower demands that unstructured solitude often requires. Well-designed systems create autopilot for routine elements of solo living, preserving cognitive and emotional resources for meaningful engagement rather than continuous basic navigation. This principle of structured simplicity transforms solo living from something requiring constant effort into a naturally flowing experience where supportive systems handle foundational needs while attention focuses on what matters most. The initial investment in creating these structures yields ongoing returns through reduced friction and enhanced capacity for presence. My own system evolved toward what I called minimum effective structure, the least amount of organization necessary to support well-being while maximizing flexibility and spontaneity. This wasn't about rigid control, but about identifying the specific supports that made the greatest difference while eliminating unnecessary complexity that created more burden than benefit. Beyond everyday structures, sustainable solo happiness requires effective strategies for navigating the inevitable challenges that arise in any lifestyle. 3 challenges deserve particular attention: managing energy fluctuations, navigating difficult emotions, and maintaining perspective during periods of doubt. Energy management becomes particularly important in solitude because external structures that naturally regulate rhythm, like workplace schedules or relationship patterns, are reduced or absent. Without these external paces, energy can easily swing between extremes of overextension and inertia rather than maintaining sustainable rhythms. Effective energy management involves recognizing your natural cycles rather than imposing idealized patterns that fight your actual rhythms. Most people experience predictable fluctuations in energy, focus, creativity, and social capacity throughout days, weeks, and months. Aligning activities with these natural cycles rather than forcing consistent output across all time periods creates sustainable rhythm. My energy management system centered around tracking patterns rather than imposing schedules. I documented energy levels, focus quality, creative flow, and emotional tone at consistent intervals for several weeks, revealing clear patterns previously obscured by external demands. This self-knowledge allowed me to design schedules that worked with rather than against my natural rhythms, dramatically reducing the willpower required to maintain productive engagement. For example, discovering that my analytical capacity peaked in mornings while creative insight flourished in late afternoon allowed me to stop fighting these patterns and instead align activities accordingly. Recognizing that my social energy followed weekly cycles helped me schedule interactive commitments during naturally extroverted periods while protecting space for deeper solitude when internal focus naturally predominated. This pattern-based approach extends to seasonal variations as well. Many people experience predictable changes in energy, mood, and preference across annual cycles, changes often but obscured by rigid year-round schedules that ignore natural fluctuations. Acknowledging and accommodating these larger rhythms reduces unnecessary struggle against biological and psychological realities. My seasonal adjustments included significant changes in daily routines, activity types, and environmental arrangements based on observed patterns throughout the year. Winter schedules emphasized inner focus, reflective practices, and consolidation of existing projects. Spring arrangements supported initiating new directions and increased social engagement. Summer patterns maximized physical activity and environmental exploration. Fall schedules focused on completion, evaluation, and preparation for the inward turn of winter. Beyond energy management, effective strategies for working with difficult emotions prove essential for solo happiness. Without others present to provide distraction, perspective, or co-regulation during challenging feelings, internal resources for emotional navigation become critically important. 3 approaches deserve particular attention: allowing, investigating, and transforming. The allowing approach involves creating space for emotions to exist without immediately attempting to change or escape them. This doesn't mean passive submission to emotional states, but rather non-resistance to their presence while maintaining awareness that you are experiencing rather than being these feelings. The simple acknowledgement, this is anger/sadness/fear moving through me right now, creates crucial distance between identity and temporary emotional states. My allowing practice centered around what I called emotional breathing room, a designated physical space in my home specifically for experiencing difficult emotions without agenda. When intense feelings arose, I would move to this space for a defined period, typically 10-15 minutes, permitting the emotion to be fully present without requiring myself to immediately act, solve, or transform anything. This simple boundary prevented both suppression and over-identification with emotional states. The investigating approach builds on allowing by bringing curious attention to the structure and information content of emotional states. Rather than treating feelings as problems to solve, this approach explores them as messengers carrying potentially valuable data about needs, boundaries, values, or unrecognized patterns. Questions like, what is this feeling showing me, and what need might be behind this response, transform difficult emotions from adversaries into informants. My investigation practice involved maintaining what I called an emotional field guide, a journal documenting patterns, triggers, and insights about recurrent emotional states. Like a naturalist studying ecosystems, I approached feelings with precision rather than generalization, distinguishing between similar but distinct states like disappointment and discouragement, or anxiety and anticipation. This detailed mapping transformed my relationship with emotions from adversarial to collaborative. The transforming approach works directly with the energy of emotions rather than their narrative content, utilizing practices that shift states through physical, sensory, or attentional means rather than analytical understanding alone. This approach recognizes that emotions involve complete body-mind activation patterns that often respond more effectively to embodied interventions than purely cognitive approaches. Effective transformation practices might include movement that expresses the emotional energy quality, breath patterns that shift autonomic nervous system states, sensory inputs that interrupt reaction cycles, or attentional practices that expand awareness beyond the narrow focus emotions typically create. These approaches don't deny or suppress feelings but work skillfully with their energy toward beneficial expression. My transformation toolkit included specific practices matched to different emotional states: vigorous movement for anxiety, slow rhythmic breathing for anger, cold water exposure for rumination, expanded peripheral vision for fear-based contraction. These weren't about controlling emotions,
but about engaging with them as energy forms capable of constructive channeling rather than merely disruptive experiences to endure. The third major challenge in sustainable solo happiness involves maintaining perspective during inevitable periods of doubt about your chosen path. Cultural messaging consistently reinforces coupled living as the default successful life pattern, creating persistent background pressure that can intensify during difficult periods or developmental transitions. Strategies for maintaining clear perspective during these challenging phases prove essential for sustainable solo happiness. Effective perspective maintenance involves several elements: documenting positive solitude experiences during fulfilling periods to review during difficult phases, cultivating relationships with others who model successful solo living rather than exclusively comparing yourself to conventional life patterns, and developing personalized responses to common undermining messages from both internal and external sources. My perspective practice centered around what I called evidence collection, systematic documentation of fulfillment, insight, growth, and genuine joy experienced through solo living. During inevitable periods when cultural messages or temporary difficulties created doubt, this accumulated evidence provided reality testing against the distorted perception that can emerge when comparing one's own challenging moments to others' curated public presentations. Another crucial aspect of maintaining perspective involves financial strategies that support genuine choice rather than dependency. Economic self-sufficiency creates the foundation for authentic decisions about relationship patterns rather than choices driven by financial necessity. While complete independence may not be immediately achievable, progressive movement towards sustainable self-support expands the field of genuine choice. Effective financial strategies for solo living involve several elements: expense structures that remain manageable on a single income, emergency reserves that provide security without
requiring partnership for safety, retirement planning that doesn't assume shared resources in later life, and insurance protections that address specific solo vulnerabilities like income interruption without backup support. My financial approach centered around what I called choice-preserving decisions, prioritizing options that maintained future flexibility rather than maximizing immediate benefits through choices that created dependency. This sometimes meant accepting simpler living standards or delaying certain acquisitions to maintain the foundation of genuine choice about relationship structures and living patterns. This economic dimension highlights an essential principle of successful solo living: proactive design rather than reactive adaptation. Many challenges in solitude stem from attempting to fit solo reality into structures designed for coupled living without adequate modification. Proactive creation of systems, environments, and approaches specifically designed for solo thriving prevents unnecessary friction and difficulty. This principle extends to practical considerations like housing selection, where features that serve coupled living, such as split floor plans or multiple bathrooms, may matter less than elements particularly beneficial for solo dwellers, like community integration, security features, or proximity to social hubs. It includes transportation choices, technology systems, meal planning approaches, and healthcare management, all areas where default assumptions often presume household sharing rather than individual arrangements. My approach to these practical elements centered around what I called solo-optimized systems, deliberately evaluating options based on their fit with solo living requirements rather than accepting default structures designed for different circumstances. This sometimes meant creative adaptations, like developing meal planning systems specifically designed for single-person households rather than attempting to scale down approaches created for families. Beyond these fundamental systems, Sustainable solo happiness requires specific strategies for areas particularly challenging in solitude. 3 deserve special attention: creative engagement, adventure experiences, and digital wellness. Creative expression holds particular importance in solo happiness, providing essential channels for externalization of internal experience. Without regular creative outlets, solitude can become a closed feedback loop of consumption and analysis rather than generative participation in life. Yet creative practice often faces particular barriers in solitude, including the absence of natural audience, reduced external accountability, and intensified inner critic voices. Effective solo creativity involves several strategies, establishing clear containers for different creative phases to prevent premature self-judgment, creating appropriate accountability through external commitments or structured sharing, and developing specific approaches for navigating resistance periods when creative blocks emerge. My creative system centered around separating generation from evaluation, designating specific sessions exclusively for creating new material without any quality assessment, followed by separate editing sessions after sufficient distance established objective perspective. This simple boundary prevented the common pattern where internal criticism interrupts flow states, allowing creative abundance rather than scarcity to characterize solo expression. Adventure experiences similarly require specific solo strategies, addressing the common assumption that significant exploration requires companionship. Solo adventure, whether through travel, skill development, or novel experiences, builds confidence, creates memorable reference points, and prevents the narrowing of experience that can characterize routinized solitude. Yet meaningful adventure often faces practical and psychological barriers when attempted alone. Effective solo adventure involves thoughtful risk calibration rather than risk elimination, incremental expansion of comfort zones through progressive challenge, and specific preparation for common solo. This specific preparation for common solo-specific circumstances in different environments. It requires distinguishing between genuinely prohibitive risk and merely unfamiliar scenarios that create anxiety through novelty rather than actual danger. My adventure approach centered around what I called expansion projects, structured but flexible plans for exploring specific domains through progressive experience building. Rather than attempting dramatic leaps far outside existing competence, these projects involved systematic development in chosen areas through incremental challenges that built confidence and capacity without unnecessary risk or overwhelm. Digital wellness represents the third area requiring solo-specific strategies, addressing the particular vulnerability solo dwellers face regarding healthy technology engagement. Without the natural boundaries and reality checking that relationships often provide, solo living can easily slip into digital dependency, algorithmic lifestyle shaping, or excessive virtual substitution for embodied experience. Effective digital wellness involves establishing clear intentionality in technology usage, creating physical and temporal boundaries around digital engagement, regularly evaluating actual experience outcomes rather than consumption intentions, and maintaining awareness of how platform design deliberately exploits psychological vulnerabilities to maximize engagement regardless of well-being impacts. My digital approach centered around what I called technology fences, clear boundaries delineating when, where, how, and why I engaged with different digital tools. Rather than attempting complete elimination of potentially problematic technologies, these boundaries created contained usage that served authentic needs while preventing unconscious drift into consumption patterns that undermined rather than enhanced solo happiness. These various practices and systems might initially appear overwhelming in their totality. However, effective implementation doesn't require simultaneous adoption of every element,
but rather strategic selection of specific practices that address your particular patterns and
circumstances. The comprehensive framework provides options rather than obligations, offering multiple pathways toward the same destination of sustainable solo happiness. Implementation works best through phased adoption rather than attempts at complete system overhaul. 3 principles guide effective integration. Start with foundational practices that create capacity for further changes. Focus on areas where current friction causes greatest difficulty rather than theoretical ideals. And implement through small, consistent actions rather than dramatic, unsustainable shifts. My implementation approach centered around what I called minimum effective interventions, identifying the smallest changes that created the largest positive impacts in my particular circumstances. Rather than attempting wholesale lifestyle redesign, I focused on specific leverage points where modest adjustments yielded disproportionate benefits, creating positive momentum that supported further developments. For some, the highest leverage intervention might involve environmental adjustments that reduce friction around activities that generate positive states. For others, establishing consistent rituals that create reliable state transitions might provide greatest initial benefit. Still others might find that addressing specific thought patterns undermining solo experiences creates the foundation for further positive development. The art of sustainable solo happiness lies in continuous refinement rather than perfect implementation. Each practice becomes an experiment yielding information about what works for your unique circumstances, preferences, and patterns. This experimental mindset prevents rigidity and enables responsive adaptation as conditions change and development occurs. This process of ongoing development represents perhaps the greatest gift of intentional solo living, the opportunity to know yourself deeply through direct experience rather than external feedback or comparison with predetermined models. As you implement various practices, each becomes a mirror reflecting different aspects of your authentic nature, preferences, and patterns. This self-knowledge creates the foundation for genuine choice in all dimensions of life. Rather than following default patterns or reacting to external pressures, you develop the capacity to design a life aligned with your authentic nature and values. This alignment generates the sustainable joy that characterizes mature solo happiness, not the temporary high of novel experiences or achievements, but the continuous well-being that emerges from living in harmony with your genuine self. The practices and systems we've explored aren't merely techniques for making solitude tolerable, but pathways toward discovering the unique gifts that emerge only through the spaciousness that solo living provides. These aren't compensatory measures for a supposedly incomplete life, but avenues toward a distinctly valuable form of wholeness accessible through the solo journey. This perspective transforms how we approach the inevitable challenges of solo living. Difficulties become opportunities for deeper self-understanding and capacity development rather than evidence of failure or wrong choices. The natural cycles of ease and struggle that characterize any authentic path become expected terrain features rather than destabilizing surprises. As we prepare to explore how solo happiness intersects with ongoing social connections in our next section, carry forward this essential understanding. The practical strategies we've examined aren't merely coping mechanisms for an inherently deficient situation, but skillful means for accessing a uniquely valuable life path. They represent not accommodation to limitation, but deliberate cultivation of distinct possibilities that emerge specifically through the solo journey.
The capacity for generating well-being independently doesn't diminish the value of connection, but rather transforms its nature from desperate necessity to chosen enrichment. When you develop the ability to create fulfillment from within, relationships become expressions of abundance rather than attempts to fill deficiency. This fundamental shift in relationship foundation represents perhaps the most significant benefit of mastering solo happiness, a transformation we'll explore more fully as we examine how solitude and connection complement rather than contradict each other in a well-designed life. Have you ever noticed that the most fulfilling connections often emerge when you least need them? That genuine intimacy tends to flourish, not from desperate reaching but from grounded presence. This paradox sits at the heart of what we'll explore next. How solitude and connection aren't opposing forces but complementary elements of a richly textured life. The popular narrative portrays a false dichotomy, either you're happily partnered or sadly alone. This oversimplification misses the nuanced reality that many experience, that meaningful connection and nourishing solitude can coexist beautifully, each enhancing rather than diminishing the other. As we've established the foundations and practical strategies for solo happiness, we now face perhaps the most transformative question: how do we nurture authentic connection while honoring our relationship with solitude? This question challenges the either-other thinking that dominates cultural conversations about relationships. The assumption that one must choose between meaningful connection and independent living creates unnecessary limitation and prevents the emergence of more sophisticated possibilities. What if the capacity for joyful solitude actually enhances your ability to form genuine connections rather than preventing them? Consider how dependency-based relationships differ from those founded on sufficiency. When connection emerges from perceived incompleteness, relationships tend towards certain predictable patterns: excessive compromise to maintain attachment, anxiety about potential abandonment, blurred boundaries between self and other, and relationships that function as identity providers rather than companions to already established identities. Contrast this with connections that emerge from personal wholeness. These relationships typically feature clearer boundaries that respect individual autonomy, greater authenticity, as less
rides on maintaining the relationship at all costs. Reduced anxiety as self-worth doesn't depend on another's continuous validation, and paradoxically, greater intimacy as genuine sharing replaces strategic self-presentation designed to secure attachment. This distinction reveals the counterintuitive truth that developing solo happiness doesn't distance you from meaningful connection, but establishes the foundations for its healthiest expression. Rather than pulling in opposite directions, solitude skills and connection capacities mutually reinforce each other, creating an upward spiral of relational well-being. My own journey revealed this unexpected synergy. As I developed greater comfort with solitude, my relationships transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. The desperate edge that had characterized my earlier connections, the subtle clinging and performance that emerged from fear of being alone, gradually dissolved. In its place emerged a more spacious, authentic way of relating that paradoxically created deeper rather than shallower connections. I discovered that people responded differently to me as my relationship with solitude matured. Conversations became more substantive as I no longer needed to fill silence with nervous chatter. Friendships developed based on genuine resonance rather than mere availability. Romantic interactions, when they occurred, carried a different quality: the ease of someone offering companionship rather than seeking completion. This transformation didn't happen immediately but emerged gradually as internal changes manifested in external patterns. Three fundamental shifts proved particularly significant. from quantity to quality in relationship focus, from continuous partial attention to full presence in interactions, and from reactive to intentional connection patterns. The shift from quantity to quality involved releasing the cultural equation of social abundance with social success. Rather than measuring relational well-being through frequency of interaction or size of social network, I began evaluating based on depth, authenticity, and genuine nourishment. This recalibration naturally reduced certain relationships while deepening others, creating a portfolio of connections aligned with actual well-being rather than perceived social status. The practical implementation of this shift involved periodic relationship audits, compassionate but honest assessments of which connections genuinely enhanced life and which maintained through momentum or obligation. This wasn't about cold calculation but recognizing that limited relational energy deserves thoughtful allocation rather than automatic distribution based on history or convenience. My audit process centered around 3 questions. Does this relationship bring out my authentic self or a performance version? Does interaction leave me energized or depleted? Does the connection support growth or reinforce limitation? These inquiries weren't judging others' worthiness but assessing fit between specific connections and my evolving needs and values. This quality-focused approach doesn't mean maintaining only perfectly aligned relationships or expecting others to consistently meet your needs. Rather, it means making conscious choices about relationship investment based on genuine values, rather than fear, obligation, or unexamined assumptions about how social lives should look. The second shift, from partial to full attention, addressed the common pattern of being physically present but mentally elsewhere during interaction. This divided presence characterizes many contemporary relationships, with conversations frequently interrupted by device checking, environmental monitoring, or internal preoccupation with past or future concerns. Developing comfort with complete attention in solitude created capacity for complete attention in connection. The ability to be fully present with my own experience transferred directly to being fully present with others, creating the conditions for encounters characterized by depth rather than mere duration. The practical implementation involved creating conditions that supported undivided presence, dedicated interaction environments free from unnecessary distractions, device protocols that prioritized in-person connection over digital availability, and pre-interaction practices that cleared mental space for genuine engagement. These weren't rigid rules but intentional design choices that facilitated the kind of connection I genuinely valued. My approach included what I called presence preparation, brief mindfulness practices before significant interactions that shifted attention from scattered thinking to receptive awareness. This simple boundary between activities dramatically improved the quality of subsequent connections, allowing genuine encounter rather than mechanical social exchange. This full attention approach doesn't require constant intense engagement or ignoring practical realities that sometimes necessitate divided focus. Rather, it means bringing awareness to attention allocation and making conscious choices about presence rather than defaulting to continuous partial attention as the norm for all interactions. The third shift, from reactive to intentional connection, addressed the common pattern where social engagement happens primarily through responding to others' initiatives rather than consciously creating interaction aligned with authentic needs and preferences. This reactive pattern often leads to connection that fills calendars without nourishing spirits, activity without genuine engagement. Developing intentionality in solitude created capacity for intentionality in connection. The ability to design meaningful experiences alone transferred directly to designing meaningful experiences with others,
replacing automatic response with conscious creation as the primary mode of social engagement. The practical implementation involved developing what I called connection intention, clarity about what forms of interaction would genuinely serve well-being at particular times, rather than assuming all available social opportunities were equally valuable. This wasn't rigid planning, but conscious discernment between different connection possibilities based on actual needs and circumstances.
My approach included regular reflection on my current connection landscape, assessing which relationship dimensions were flourishing and which needed attention. Sometimes this revealed needs for deeper one-on-one conversation with close friends, other times for light-hearted group interaction, still others for collaborative creativity with like-minded others. This awareness allowed proactive creation of fitting connection rather than passive reception of whatever invitations happened to arrive. This intentional approach doesn't mean controlling or over-engineering social experiences, but rather bringing the same thoughtful attention to connection that you bring to solitude. It means recognizing that meaningful interaction, like meaningful solo experience, emerges more reliably through conscious design than chance occurrence. These three shifts, prioritizing quality over quantity, full attention over partial presence, and intentional over reactive patterns, transform how connection functions within a solitude-positive life. Rather than competing with solo happiness, relationships become complementary expressions of the same underlying capacities for presence, discernment, and authentic engagement. This integration requires practical strategies for navigating common challenges in the space between solitude and connection. Three areas deserve particular attention: boundary establishment, social confidence in solo contexts, and management of others' expectations and judgments. Boundary clarity becomes essential when embracing both solitude and connection, as unclear delineation between these domains creates unnecessary friction and confusion. Without established boundaries, social engagement can continuously encroach on solo time through incremental expansion, eventually eliminating the restoration and deepening that solitude provides. Effective boundaries aren't rigid walls but permeable membranes, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while sturdy enough to maintain essential distinctions. They're less about saying no to others than saying yes to your needs for both connection and solitude in appropriate balance. Implementation involves both external communication and internal permission, clearly expressing your patterns to important others while internally validating your right to maintain these distinctions without justification or apology. The underlying recognition that both domains deserve protection creates the foundation for boundary establishment free from unnecessary guilt or defensiveness. My boundary system included what I called transition protocols, specific practices for moving between solitude and connection that honored both domains. These included buffer periods between social engagement and solo time, clear communication templates for declining invitations when solitude was needed, and regular assessment of whether existing boundaries adequately protected both essential life dimensions. One particularly effective practice involved calendar blocking, designating specific periods for deep solitude that received the same protection as important external commitments. This simple visual representation transformed how I perceived these time blocks, elevating them from empty space to valued commitments deserving the same respect as external obligations. This boundary approach doesn't mean rigid inflexibility or insensitivity to others' needs and feelings. Rather, it means recognizing that sustainable relationships require honoring your genuine needs alongside others' preferences, creating conditions where connection emerges from authentic choice rather than obligation or boundary violation. Social confidence in solo contexts presents another common challenge, particularly in environments where unaccompanied presence remains unusual or stigmatized.
The cultural discomfort with people appearing alone in traditionally coupled or group settings creates unnecessary barriers to full participation in public life for those embracing solitude as a significant element of their lifestyle. Effective navigation of these situations involves both internal mindset shifts and practical strategies for comfortable solo presence in social environments. The foundation lies in recognizing that momentary discomfort stems primarily from outdated social conditioning rather than actual disapproval or judgment from others in the present moment. Implementation involves progressive exposure to initially uncomfortable solo activities, beginning with environments naturally accommodating individual presence like coffee shops or museums, then gradually expanding to restaurants, entertainment venues, and eventually celebration contexts typically oriented around couples or groups. Each successful experience builds confidence for subsequent expansions. My approach included what I called solo scripts, brief internal reminders prepared before entering potentially uncomfortable environments alone. These weren't elaborate justifications but simple perspective reframes like "my presence here is completely legitimate," or "others are far more concerned with their experience than observing mine." These statements interrupted the automatic anxiety spiral that otherwise might generate unnecessary self-consciousness. Practical strategies also included environmental selection, choosing venues with physical arrangements conducive to comfortable solo presence, counter-seating in restaurants, end seats in theaters, timing considerations to avoid peak couples family periods when solo presence might feel more conspicuous, and activity pairing that provided natural focus beyond social awareness, bringing a book to a cafe, taking notes at cultural events. This confidence approach doesn't require becoming completely impervious to social awareness or ignoring genuine safety considerations that sometimes make solo presence inadvisable in specific contexts. Rather, it means developing sufficient comfort with temporary discomfort to access the full range of experiences available, regardless of accompaniment status. Managing others' expectations and judgments represents the third significant challenge in integrating solitude and connection. Even as your relationship with solitude matures, significant
Others in your life may continue viewing your solo choices through lenses of concern, confusion, or criticism, creating continuous pressure to justify or abandon your chosen balance. Effective management of these external perspectives involves understanding the common sources of others' reactions, developing appropriate responses that neither defensive nor apologetic, and creating sufficient internal stability that external opinions inform but don't determine your choices. Implementation involves recognizing that others' concerns typically reflect their own relationship with solitude rather than objective evaluation of your circumstances. Those uncomfortable with their own company often project this discomfort onto your choices, interpreting your comfort with solitude as either superior capacity they lack or denial of needs they assume must exist. My approach included developing what I called translation statements, bridges between others' concern frameworks and my actual experience. Rather than arguing against their perspective directly, these statements acknowledged the legitimate care often underlying their concerns while gently correcting misperceptions about my actual experience. For instance, when family members expressed worry about holiday periods spent alone, I'd respond, "I appreciate your concern, and I know it comes from wanting me to feel connected and loved." What might be hard to understand is that I genuinely enjoy these quiet celebrations and find them meaningful in ways different from, but not lesser than, traditional gatherings. I'm not settling for isolation, but choosing a different kind of rich experience. This translation approach doesn't mean endless explanation or seeking approval for personal choices. Rather, it means recognizing that sustained relationships sometimes require bridges between different experiential worlds, creating sufficient understanding for respectful coexistence without demanding complete agreement or validation. Beyond these specific strategies, sustainable integration of solitude and connection involves developing skills for specific challenging contexts, navigating holidays and celebrations, managing family expectations, and addressing romantic assumptions in a culture that prioritizes couples. Holiday navigation deserves particular attention because these periods often intensify cultural messaging about proper relational configurations while simultaneously reducing access to normal routines and support structures. The contrast between celebratory expectations and solo reality can create unnecessary distress without specific strategies for meaningful alternative experiences. Effective holiday navigation involves proactive design rather than reactive coping, creating intentional solo celebrations aligned with personal values rather than attempting to ignore or merely endure traditional occasions. This design process begins with identifying the genuine needs. These periods are meant to address connection, meaning, transition marking, sensory pleasure, and developing alternative pathways to meeting these needs. My holiday approach included creating what I called parallel traditions, solo practices that fulfilled the same underlying functions as conventional celebrations, but in forms aligned with my circumstances and preferences. These weren't compensatory substitutes, but authentic alternatives that genuinely served the transitional and meaning-making purposes holidays ideally provide. For winter holidays traditionally centered around family gathering, I developed a personal retreat format incorporating elements of reflection, intention setting, sensory pleasure through special foods and environments, and selective connection through thoughtfully timed reach-outs to significant others. This wasn't about pretending the conventional holiday wasn't happening, but creating a meaningful alternative that served similar psychological functions through different forms. This approach doesn't mean rejecting all conventional celebration or refusing inclusion in others' gatherings when genuinely desired. Rather, it means developing sufficient alternative capacity that participation becomes genuine choice rather than dependency, allowing discerning selection of which traditional elements serve your well-being and which might better be replaced with personally meaningful alternatives. Family navigation presents related but distinct challenges, particularly when established expectations about participation's availability and life progressions conflict with solo positive choices. Without specific strategies for maintaining both authentic relationships and personal boundaries, family systems often exert continuous pressure toward conventional relationship patterns, regardless of individual flourishing. Effective family navigation involves establishing clear expectations without unnecessary confrontation, demonstrating rather than defending the validity of your choices, and maintaining compassionate understanding of family members' genuine difficulty, comprehending life patterns significantly different from their own experience or cultural expectations. Implementation involves recognizing the distinction between boundaries that require verbal establishment and those better demonstrated through consistent behavior over time. Many family adjustments happen more smoothly through gradual exposure to your actual flourishing than through declarative statements about your different approach to relationship and solitude. My family approach centered around what I called showing not telling, consistently demonstrating contentment, purpose and wholeness through my actual presence, rather than attempting to verbally convince skeptical family members that my choices created genuine happiness. This demonstration wasn't performance but authentic sharing of my actual experience without defensive overlays that often create rather than resolve resistance.
When verbal clarification became necessary, I focused on personal experience statements rather than comparative or defensive positions. I've discovered that having significant solo time gives me the recharge I need to be fully present when we're together, rather than I need space.
Because family gatherings are overwhelming. This framing presented my needs as additions to rather than rejections of family connection. This navigation approach doesn't mean completely accommodating family expectations at personal expense or severing connections that can't immediately accept your choices. Rather, it means creating sufficient space for your authentic needs while maintaining patience with adjustment processes that often require time and demonstrated evidence rather than immediate understanding. Romantic assumption management represents perhaps the most challenging integration area in cultures that center coupled status as primary life achievement and relationship indicator. The continuous external messaging that meaningful life requires romantic partnership creates persistent pressure that can undermine even well-established solo happiness without specific countering strategies. Effective navigation involves both internal mindset work and external boundary setting, developing personal clarity about your actual relationship needs and preferences while establishing appropriate responses to unsolicited romantic advice, set-up attempts, and expressions of concern about your uncoupled status. The foundation lies in distinguishing between genuine desire for romantic connection and conditioned belief that such connection represents mandatory life achievement. This distinction requires honest self-assessment about whether partnership represents an authentic want or an internalized should, recognizing that either answer is completely valid but leads to different navigation approaches. My approach involved periodic desire inventory practices, structured reflection, distinguishing between what I genuinely wanted in relationship domains versus what I believed would bring approval or conventionally defined success. This clarity allowed me to pursue authentic connection desires while releasing the continuous background pressure to conform to relationship expectations that didn't match my actual preferences. For those genuinely desiring romantic partnership while maintaining solo happiness capacity, integration involves approaching dating and relationship formation from sufficiency rather than deficiency, seeking connections that enhance an already complete life rather than attempting to find someone who will make life finally feel valid or meaningful. This sufficiency-based approach dramatically transforms the dating experience, replacing anxiety about approval with curiosity about compatibility, reducing pressure to form attachments regardless of alignment, and creating space for discernment about whether specific connections genuinely enhance well-being rather than merely providing relationship status. My dating approach centered around what I called enhancement criteria, specific reflection on whether potential relationships would actually improve quality of life beyond what I'd created alone. This wasn't cold calculation but honest assessment of whether connection with specific individuals would contribute to or detract from the well-being I'd established independently. This clarity allowed recognition of genuinely fitting connections while preventing attachment to misaligned relationships that offered only conventional status. For those not currently desiring romantic partnership, integration involves developing clear but non-defensive responses to the persistent cultural assumption that everyone must want coupled status. These responses ideally acknowledge others' good intentions while gently correcting misperceptions without treating alternatives to conventional romance as requiring elaborate justification. My approach included developing what I called a broken record technique, calm, consistent restatement of my actual experience without escalating defensiveness regardless of how often assumptions arose. Rather than engaging the premise that my choices required defense, I simply restated my experience with gentle persistence,
I genuinely enjoy my life as it is, rather than mounting increasingly elaborate justifications for solo living. This approach doesn't mean never reconsidering relationship preferences or permanently closing possibilities for connection patterns you don't currently desire. Rather, it means making choices based on authentic current preferences rather than future possibilities or others' expectations, remaining open to evolution while honoring present reality. Beyond these specific navigation strategies, sustainable integration of solitude and connection involves developing what might be called connection wisdom, nuanced understanding of how different relationship forms serve different functions with none capable of meeting all human needs for every person at all times. This wisdom recognizes that various connection types, deep friendship, family bonds, romantic partnership, community belonging, mentorship relationships, creative collaborations, spiritual connections, offer distinct gifts with unique limitations. No single relationship form, including romantic partnership, can possibly fulfill all human connection needs, despite cultural messaging to the contrary. Developing connection wisdom involves creating a personalized relationship portfolio aligned with your specific needs and preferences rather than defaulting to cultural templates that may prioritize forms misaligned with your actual well-being requirements. This portfolio typically evolves through experience and reflection rather than emerging fully formed through theoretical understanding alone. My own relationship portfolio developed through what I called connection experiments, structured but open-ended exploration of how different relationship types affected my well-being. Rather than assuming romantic partnership should dominate with other connections serving subordinate roles, the conventional template, I approached each form as potentially primary, depending on what genuinely enhanced my particular life configuration. This experimental approach revealed surprisingly individual patterns. I discovered that creative collaborations provided an essential connection dimension that romantic relationships often didn't engage, while certain friendships offered emotional intimacy sometimes assumed
available only through partnership. These discoveries allowed construction of a relationship portfolio precisely tailored to my needs, rather than conforming to generic cultural expectations. This portfolio approach doesn't mean treating relationships as utilitarian arrangements or reducing human connections to functional classifications. Rather, it means bringing conscious awareness to the reality that different connections serve different purposes, creating space for appreciation of each form's unique gifts, rather than expecting any single relationship to fulfill impossible comprehensive requirements. The integration of solitude and connection ultimately transcends tactical strategies arising from a fundamental perspective shift, recognizing that these elements exist in complementary rather than competitive relationship. This shift transforms how you experience both domains, each enhancing rather than diminishing the other in an ongoing dance of engagement and restoration. In this integrated perspective, solitude provides the essential foundation for authentic connection by developing the self-knowledge, emotional regulation, and inner sufficiency that make genuine rather than desperate relationship possible. Simultaneously, connection offers the external perspective, diverse input, and collaborative possibilities unavailable through even the richest solo experience. This complementary understanding replaces the either-or mentality that creates unnecessary suffering around relationship status with both, and recognition that humans genuinely need both autonomy and attachment, independence and interdependence, solitude and connection. Not as compromises, but as essential complementary elements of well-lived lives. The mature integration of these elements manifests as fluid movement between domains without sharp distinction between social time and alone time, as categorically different experiences. Instead, both emerge as varied expressions of the same underlying capacity for authentic presence, sometimes expressed through engaged connection with others, sometimes through engaged connection with oneself. This fluid integration represents perhaps the ultimate freedom in relationship to both solitude and connection, the capacity to enjoy either state without dependency on or aversion to the other. This freedom doesn't emerge immediately, but develops gradually through consistent practice of the principles and strategies we've explored. The journey toward this integration isn't a straight path, but rather a spiral process, revisiting similar terrain at progressively deeper levels as capacity develops. Periods of stronger focus on solo capacity often alternate with phases emphasizing connection skills, each strengthening the other through their complementary demands and gifts. What matters isn't achieving perfect balance at every moment, but developing sufficient capacity in both domains that authentic choice becomes possible. This capacity creates the foundation for perhaps the most meaningful freedom available in human experience, the ability to choose connection from desire rather than fear, and to choose solitude from sufficiency rather than avoidance. As we prepare to explore the elevated possibilities that emerge through mastery of solo living in our final section, carry forward this essential understanding: the integration of solitude and connection represents not compromise between competing needs, but synergy between complementary capacities. The ability to be happily alone doesn't diminish your capacity for meaningful connection, but establishes the foundation for its most authentic expression. The most profound relationships often emerge not from desperate seeking, but from the grounded sufficiency that makes genuine rather than needy connection possible. From this foundation, relationships become chosen expressions of abundance rather than attempted solutions for perceived deficiency, transforming not just your experience of being alone, but your experience of being together. What does it mean to not merely accept solitude, but to elevate it into an art form? What becomes possible when being alone transforms from circumstance to cornerstone, not just a skill you've developed, but a foundation from which you create an extraordinary life? We've journeyed from the surprising twist that began our exploration, the counterintuitive discovery that solitude could be a pathway to profound happiness rather than something to be avoided. We've built psychological foundations, implemented practical strategies, and developed approaches for balancing connection with solitude. Now we arrive at perhaps the most compelling question: what heights become accessible when solo living evolves beyond competence into mastery? This question invites us to look beyond merely coping with being alone toward the unique gifts that emerge through embracing solitude as a positive force in its own right. The elevated solo life isn't about making the best of limitation, but about accessing possibilities uniquely available through this particular life path. Consider the distinction between baseline functioning and genuine flourishing. Many approaches to solo living focus primarily on reaching acceptable comfort, developing sufficient skills to prevent loneliness, maintain functionality, and achieve basic contentment. While these foundations are essential, they represent only the beginning of what's possible rather than the ultimate destination. The truly elevated solo life transcends this baseline to access states of exceptional well-being, creativity, purpose, and wisdom uniquely available through the spaciousness that solitude provides. This elevated experience doesn't happen automatically, but emerges through deliberate cultivation of specific capacities that transform being alone from neutral circumstance to powerful catalyst. The first of these elevated capacities involves transcending the happiness baseline through what psychologists call peak experiences, moments of exceptional aliveness, connection, and meaning
that stand above ordinary contentment, while often associated with rare or
extraordinary circumstances. These elevated states become increasingly accessible through developed solo capacity. The connection between solitude and peak experience emerges through what might be called attentional purity, the capacity to engage reality with undivided presence, free from the fragmentation that characterizes much contemporary experience. This undivided attention creates the conditions for states of flow, or creative absorption, and transcendent connection that constitute the upper registers of human experience. Paradoxically, the absence of external distractions in solitude creates unique opportunity for this attentional purity. While social interaction offers many irreplaceable gifts, it inherently divides attention between internal experience and interpersonal awareness. The cognitive bandwidth devoted to reading others' cues, managing impressions, and navigating social dynamics necessarily reduces capacity available for complete immersion in direct experience. My own journey revealed how solitude could facilitate rather than prevent these peak states. Without the subtle attention splits that even the most comfortable social situations create, I discovered capacity for deeper absorption in natural beauty, creative engagement, contemplative insight, and sensory presence than previously available. These weren't compensatory pleasures, but qualitatively different experiences made possible specifically through the attentional conditions that solitude provides. Cultivating this capacity involves developing what I called full-spectrum attention, the ability to engage experience through multiple simultaneous channels rather than the narrower bandwidth that divided attention allows. This includes simultaneous awareness of conceptual, emotional, sensory, intuitive, and somatic dimensions rather than the reduced spectrum typically available when attention divides between external and internal demands. The practical development of this capacity begins with intentional attention training through practices that progressively expand awareness beyond habitual channels. These might include structured approaches like meditation or contemplative arts, but equally incorporate everyday activities transformed through deliberate attentional shifts, ordinary walks approached with extraordinary presence, routine tasks engaged with full sensory awareness, familiar environments perceived with fresh attentional quality. My practice centered around what I called immersion sessions, dedicated periods for engaging ordinary experiences with extraordinary attention. Unlike conventional mindfulness, which often emphasizes neutral observation, these sessions involved active cultivation of full-spectrum engagement, deliberately bringing multiple attention channels online simultaneously to create the conditions for peak rather than baseline experience. For example, rather than merely noticing sensations during a nature walk, the mindfulness approach, I would simultaneously engage conceptual understanding of ecological relationships, emotional resonance with the setting's qualities, sensory immersion in immediate details, intuitive receptivity to the environment's unique essence, and somatic awareness of my body's responses to the total experience. This multi-channel attention created the conditions for genuine awe and wonder rather than merely pleasant appreciation. This attention practice doesn't require elaborate setups or special circumstances, but rather bringing exceptional quality to ordinary moments through shifted relationship with your own awareness. The most mundane activities, preparing food, feeling water on skin, noticing light patterns, experiencing breath, transform through this attentional shift from background experiences to potential portals for peak states. The second elevated capacity builds upon this attentional foundation, developing unusual depth in chosen domains through what might be called progressive mastery,
the committed exploration of specific disciplines, practices or knowledge areas beyond casual engagement toward genuine expertise. While often associated with career specialization, this depth dimension becomes uniquely available in well-designed solo living through the consistent, focused attention it allows. The connection between solitude and progressive mastery emerges through what research identifies as the conditions for developing genuine expertise: sustained deliberate practice, uninterrupted deep work sessions, consistent engagement over extended time periods, and intrinsically motivated exploration free from extrinsic pressures. These conditions become distinctively accessible through solo living patterns that provide both the time and attentional space required for exceptional development. My own experience revealed how solitude could accelerate rather than impede this depth dimension. The capacity to design extended periods around mastery pursuit without navigating competing priorities or interruption patterns created conditions for unusually rapid skill development in chosen areas. These weren't compensatory accomplishments, but accelerated growth trajectories made possible specifically through the focused conditions that intentional solitude provides. Cultivating this capacity involves identifying what I call depth domains, specific areas perfectly matched to your intrinsic interests and natural aptitudes rather than externally determined specialties. These ideally combine genuine fascination, natural facility, and meaningful application, creating the conditions for what psychologists call vital engagement, where skill development becomes intrinsically rewarding rather than effortful discipline. The practical development pathway involves designing progressive learning structures that transform casual interest into systematic mastery through deliberate practice principles, creating clear feedback mechanisms, establishing appropriate challenge levels, implementing spaced repetition for skill consolidation, and documenting progress to maintain motivation through plateaus and difficulty periods. My approach centered around what I called expertise projects, structured but flexible frameworks for developing uncommon depth in specific domains through consistent, dedicated practice. Rather than diffusing attention across numerous casual interests, a common pattern in
undirected solo time. This approach created concentrated engagement in fewer areas with correspondingly accelerated development trajectories. This mastery approach doesn't mean eliminating variety or becoming narrowly specialized, but rather creating deliberate distinction between casual interests engaged for immediate pleasure and depth domains pursued for progressive mastery. Both have legitimate places in well-designed solo living, but clarity about their different purposes prevents the common pattern where everything receives equal but insufficient attention for either immediate enjoyment or meaningful development. The third elevated capacity integrates these attentional and depth dimensions, accessing unusual meaning through what might be called purpose incarnation, the embodied expression of values and contributions uniquely aligned with your particular constellation of gifts, perspectives, and circumstances. While purpose is obviously available through many life patterns, solo living creates distinctive opportunities for its identification and expression through the exceptional self-knowledge and design freedom it provides. The connection between solitude and purpose clarity emerges through what philosophers call the examined life, the capacity to identify authentic values and meaningful contribution free from excessive external imprinting or unconscious conformity. The reduced social scripting that characterizes well-designed solo living creates unique conditions for distinguishing between inherited purpose templates and genuinely resonant callings that emerge from your particular nature. My experience revealed how solitude could clarify rather than obscure this purpose dimension. The opportunity to systematically experiment with different contribution forms without continuously negotiating external expectations created accelerated discovery of where my specific gifts could create meaningful impact. This wasn't compensatory meaning-making but accelerated alignment made possible specifically through the experimental conditions that intentional solitude provides. Cultivating this capacity involves developing what I called meaning sensitivity, the ability to accurately distinguish between activities that provide temporary pleasure or achievement and those that connect to enduring sources of purpose and significance. This discernment requires systematic attention to subtle internal signals that indicate alignment with deeper values rather than mere preference or social approval. The practical development pathway involves creating deliberate purpose experiments, structured but open-ended exploration of different contribution forms to identify those that consistently generate the psychological markers of meaningful engagement, unusual energy rather than depletion, time transformation where hours pass unnoticed, natural motivation requiring minimal willpower, and sense of rightness beyond rational justification. My approach centered around what I called impact inquiry, ongoing investigation into where my particular combination of capabilities could create maximum meaningful difference given current realities and opportunities. Rather than adopting generic purpose frameworks or assuming meaning must take conventional forms, this approach created space for genuinely individualized contribution aligned with specific gifts rather than generalized expectations. This purpose dimension doesn't require grand visible missions or traditional contribution forms. Meaning emerges equally through direct service relationships, creative work that inspires or illuminates, knowledge development that expands human understanding, system improvements that reduce suffering, or countless other expressions that engage authentic values through tangible impact, regardless of scale or recognition. The fourth, elevated capacity, builds upon this purpose foundation, developing uncommon wisdom through what might be called perspective synthesis, the integration of diverse knowledge, experience, and understanding into coherent frameworks that transcend specialized silos or conventional categorizations. While wisdom development is available through many pathways, solo living creates distinctive opportunities for its cultivation through the unique reflection space and integration capacity it provides. The connection between solitude and wisdom development emerges through what contemplative traditions call the witnessing perspective, the capacity to observe patterns, connections, and implications across domains without being narrowly identified with specific viewpoints or trapped within conventional thought categories. The reduced pressure for consistency with established positions that characterizes well-designed solo living creates unique conditions for thinking that transcends rather than merely operates within existing frameworks. My experience revealed how solitude could accelerate rather than impede this wisdom dimension. The opportunity for extended integration periods free from continuous external input or position defense created conditions for insights that connected rather than merely accumulated knowledge. These weren't compensatory perspectives but emergent understandings made possible specifically through the integration conditions that intentional solitude provides. Cultivating this capacity involves developing what I called metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking rather than merely thinking thoughts, observing the patterns, assumptions, and frameworks that shape perception rather than engaging only with content produced by these structures. This meta-level awareness requires systematic attention to how you construct understanding rather than merely what conclusions you reach. The practical development pathway involves creating deliberate integration practices, structured reflection that connects knowledge across traditional boundaries, examines assumptions underlying conventional understandings,
and systematically considers perspectives initially appearing contradictory to identify potential synthesis, rather than merely choosing between existing positions.
My approach centered around what I called wisdom notebooks, ongoing documentation of emerging understandings that transcended traditional category boundaries or connected insights from apparently unrelated domains. Rather than organizing knowledge through conventional subject divisions, this approach created space for recognizing patterns, principles, and perspectives that operated across rather than within established classification systems. This wisdom approach doesn't require academic credentials or traditional philosophical training, but rather systematic attention to understanding processes themselves rather than merely accumulating information. The capacity develops through consistent meta-level engagement with how you construct meaning, rather than simply what specific meanings you construct in particular domains. The fifth, elevated capacity integrates all previous dimensions, developing inner autonomy through what might be called self-authorship. The capacity to define and create your life according to internal values and understanding, rather than external scripting or reactive patterns. While some degree of self-determination is available through many life arrangements, solo living creates distinctive opportunities for its development through the reduced external scaffolding and increased design responsibility it provides. The connection between solitude and self-authorship emerges through what developmental psychologists call internal authority. The capacity to evaluate information, make decisions, and determine values based on integrated personal judgment rather than external validation or unconscious conditioning. The reduced default structures that characterize solo living necessitate developing this internal authority, transforming potential disorientation into uncommon autonomy when successfully navigated. My experience revealed how solitude could strengthen rather than weaken this autonomy dimension. The continuous opportunity to distinguish between authentic preferences and conditioned responses across numerous daily decisions created accelerated development of internal reference systems. This wasn't isolating disconnection, but enhanced discernment made possible specifically through the choice conditions that intentional solitude provides. Cultivating this capacity involves developing what I called choice consciousness, bringing awareness to decision points typically operating below conscious threshold, examining the actual basis for preferences and behaviors, and gradually shifting from automatic to intentional functioning across increasingly subtle life dimensions. This consciousness requires systematic attention to how you actually make choices rather than focusing exclusively on what specific choices you make. The practical development pathway involves creating decision clarity practices, structured reflection that distinguishes between choices based on genuine values versus fear, social approval, or unconscious conditioning. This includes identifying decision domains operating primarily on autopilot and systematically bringing consciousness to previously automatic functioning. My approach centered around what I called choice audits, periodic examination of recent decisions across various life domains to identify their actual motivational basis and gradually increase the percentage emerging from authentic values rather than reactive patterns. These weren't exhaustive analyses of every choice, but strategic examination of decisions likely revealing important patterns or operating as leverage points for broader development. This autonomy dimension doesn't mean ignoring external input or dismissing social wisdom, but rather developing sufficient internal authority to evaluate outside perspectives from grounded self-knowledge rather than unconscious susceptibility. The capacity manifests as genuine choice capacity rather than either reflexive compliance or reactive opposition to external influences. These 5 elevated capacities, transcending the happiness baseline through peak experiences,
developing unusual depth through progressive mastery, accessing meaningful purpose through aligned contribution, cultivating wisdom through perspective synthesis, and establishing autonomy through self-authorship represent distinctive possibilities available through the solo path when approached as catalyst rather than merely circumstance to navigate. The integration of these capacities creates what might be called the sovereign self, not in the sense of isolation or excessive self-sufficiency, but in the sense of internal coherence and self-determination that allows authentic engagement with others from wholeness rather than dependency. This sovereignty doesn't separate you from others, but provides the foundation for connection based on genuine choice rather than unconscious need or social default. This sovereignty manifests through what I came to recognize as paradoxical capacities, the ability to be fully independent, yet deeply connected, completely self-referential, yet genuinely considerate of others, absolutely autonomous, yet naturally interdependent. These seeming contradictions resolve not through compromise but through transcendence, moving beyond the either-or framings that create unnecessary opposition between complementary human capacities. Throughout history, individuals who developed these paradoxical capacities often made distinctive contributions precisely because they operated from unconventional perspectives made possible through uncommon relationships with solitude. From philosophers who recognized patterns others missed to artists who expressed previously unarticulated truths to scientists who questioned fundamental assumptions to spiritual teachers who embodied integrated wisdom, the capacity to step outside conventional patterns through comfort with solitude repeatedly enabled perspectives and contributions unavailable through more standard life arrangements. This historical pattern doesn't mean everyone embracing solitude automatically accesses exceptional capacities or creates world-changing contributions. Rather, it suggests that the solo path, when approached with appropriate development practices, creates distinctive possibilities.
Worth-conscious cultivation, rather than representing mere alternative to conventionally scripted living. My own journey revealed how these elevated capacities develop not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through consistent integration of small shifts across extended time periods. The progression resembles compound interest more than sudden transformation, modest improvements applied consistently yielding exponential rather than linear development over sufficient duration. This developmental reality holds both challenge and promise. The challenge lies in sustaining practices through inevitable plateaus and difficulties without the external accountability structures that often maintain momentum in more conventional paths. The promise emerges through the compounding effects that make previously unimaginable capacities gradually accessible through persistent engagement with appropriate development processes. The elevated solo life ultimately represents not arrival at final destination, but ongoing evolution through continuous engagement with expanding possibilities. Each capacity development creates foundation for new growth dimensions previously unavailable, establishing progressive spiral rather than linear path or static endpoint. This evolution continues indefinitely, with each level revealing new possibilities invisible from previous perspectives. As our exploration nears completion, perhaps the most important understanding emerges: the elevated solo life doesn't require exceptional circumstances or special endowment, but remains accessible through consistent application of principles and practices we've examined. The capacity for exceptional solo living represents not rare talent, but learnable skill set, available to anyone willing to engage the necessary development processes with appropriate persistence and attention. This democratization of elevated solitude contradicts cultural messaging that exceptional well-being requires exceptional circumstances, the core capacities allowing transcendent solo experience develop through ordinary practices consistently applied rather than extraordinary conditions or special access. The limiting factor isn't circumstance, but commitment to specific development pathways that conventional cultural scripts rarely emphasize or validate. My own experience repeatedly confirmed this accessibility principle. The most significant breakthroughs emerged not from dramatic interventions or special opportunities, but from consistent engagement with fundamental practices, attention training, perspective examination, intentional discomfort engagement, choice consciousness, and progressive mastery pursuit. These accessible approaches, applied with persistence rather than perfection, created development trajectory that continuously expanded rather than plateaued over time. This understanding liberates the elevated solo vision from elitist framing that might otherwise limit its perceived relevance. The exceptional solo life represents not special category for the unusually gifted or privileged, but available pathway for anyone recognizing its value and willing to engage its development requirements. The distinguishing factor becomes choice and commitment rather than circumstance or endowment. As we conclude this exploration, the journey comes full circle to the surprising twist that began our investigation, the counterintuitive discovery that solitude could represent pathway to exceptional well-being rather than circumstance to merely tolerate or overcome. This initial reversal now expands into comprehensive reframing that recognizes solo living as potentially catalytic rather than merely alternative life pattern. Remember that moment at the crowded party where I first recognized the hollowness beneath my seemingly perfect social life? That recognition didn't lead merely to acceptable alternative, but to discovering capacities and experiences I couldn't have imagined from my original perspective. The journey from that initial discomfort, through development of solo foundations, implementation of practical strategies, integration of connection with solitude, and ultimately cultivation of elevated capacities represents not mere adaptation, but genuine transformation. This transformation doesn't mean solo living represents superior path for everyone, or that relationship-centered approaches lack their own unique gifts and possibilities. Different life patterns offer distinctive development opportunities, with none exclusively containing all potential human goods. The elevated solo vision doesn't claim universal superiority, but rather challenges the automatic assumption that coupled or highly socially embedded patterns necessarily provide optimal well-being contexts for all individuals. What matters isn't which specific life pattern you choose, but the consciousness you bring to that choice, the capacity to select arrangements aligned with your authentic nature and development needs, rather than unconsciously adopting default patterns through conditioning or fear-based decision-making. This choice consciousness represents perhaps the ultimate freedom available through the development journey we've explored. My own path continues evolving rather than representing completed project or final resolution. The capacities developed through intentional solo living create foundation for ongoing exploration rather than static endpoint, continuously revealing new dimensions and possibilities invisible from previous perspectives. This evolution itself represents one of solitude's greatest gifts, the continuous expansion of possibility through progressive development rather than arrival at predetermined destination. As you reflect on your own relationship with solitude, whether as primary life dimension or periodic element within different arrangement, consider the invitation this exploration offers to recognize being alone, not merely as circumstance to navigate,
but as potential catalyst for exceptional development across multiple human capacities. This perspective transforms how we approach both everyday solitude moments and larger life design choices, revealing opportunities within experiences our culture often teaches us merely to tolerate or overcome. The capacity for joyful solitude ultimately represents not specialized skill but fundamental human birthright. The ability to be genuinely at home in your own company and to generate
well-being from within, rather than depending exclusively on external circumstance or relationship. This birthright becomes accessible not through rare talent, but through consistent engagement with developmental processes that conventional scripts rarely emphasize, but remain available to anyone recognizing their value. Your journey with solitude may follow different trajectory than mine, or manifest through different specific practices and approaches. What matters isn't the particular form but the fundamental recognition that being alone can catalyze, rather than merely accommodate human flourishing when approached with appropriate development intention. This recognition itself begins transformation from viewing solitude as potential problem to seeing it as distinctive opportunity for exceptional growth and well-being. The choice now lies with you, not necessarily to embrace solo living as primary arrangement, but to recognize the development possibilities solitude offers regardless of your specific life structure. Will you approach alone time as mere gap between real experiences or as unique opportunity for capacities inaccessible through continuous engagement? Will you design your relationship with solitude intentionally or allow cultural default assumptions to determine its meaning and function in your life? These questions invite not final answers, but ongoing inquiry, continuous exploration of how different balances and approaches might serve your particular nature and development needs across different life phases and circumstances. This exploration itself represents one of self-authorship's greatest gifts, the capacity to design your relationship with fundamental human experiences according to authentic values rather than unconscious conditioning. As we complete this journey together, carry forward not rigid conclusions, but expanded perception of possibility, recognition that happiness alone represents not merely acceptable alternative, but potentially transformative path with unique gifts, unavailable through other arrangements. This expanded perception creates the foundation for genuine choice about how solitude functions in your life, rather than unconscious acceptance of cultural messaging about its meaning and value. The surprising twist that began our exploration now reveals itself not as anomaly, but as window into broader truth about human flourishing, that many conventional assumptions about happiness requirements benefit from thoughtful examination rather than automatic acceptance. This examination itself represents first step toward genuinely self-authored life, aligned with your authentic nature, rather than external expectation or unconscious conditioning. May your journey with solitude, whether as primary life dimension or periodic element within different arrangement, become increasingly conscious, intentional, and aligned with your genuine development possibilities. The capacity for exceptional solo living remains your birthright, not distant ideal but accessible reality through consistent engagement with fundamental practices we've explored together. The elevated solo life awaits not as distant possibility, but as continuously unfolding reality through each intentional step on this transformative path.